Brother May, can you hear me by any chance?
He's muted.
Yep, I see that. I'm asking him to unmute.
I can hear you.
Ah, Wayne May, mystery guest arrives.
Hey, I just tuned in to listen to you guys.
Oh, that's you're a delight. Hey, you know, I've got you on audio. I don't have you on video currently, but we just got through with your first four chapters.
That's okay, because I'm sitting here in my hot tub.
Oh, thank you, technology, for not being the lack of automated technology. No way you're in a hot tub. It must be 5 degrees up there in rural Wisconsin right now.
Well, who says I'm in Wisconsin?
Oh my goodness, I thought you were. Can't keep track of it. What are you chasing down some more ground penetrating evidence down there in Montrose?
Oh, I've got a lot. There's so much coming out this spring and into the summer, you won't believe.
Well, let's take 5 minutes to talk about that.
All right.
Because we just got through explaining the DVD, of course, I mentioned as I said I would. And I think people understand that that's such a good consolidated package of all the information one might need to, you know, have a good understanding of the Heartland model. But really your focus has shifted almost entirely on your excavation there across from Nauvoo. So why don't you give us, you know, your short version of an update on that and what we might be able to anticipate?
Well, yeah, right now we are in what we just simply call an exploration mode. We have scanned over 500 acres in November.
Wow.
And we covered a distance. I mean, we were between a little over a 2-mile stretch in that area, which the locals call the bean. And when you look at it from the sky, it looks like a giant kidney bean there across from Nauvoo. It's because of the big ridge, and they call it the bean. And so actually we have permission to walk on about 2,000 acres, but we can only get 500 and some scanned, which was good. And now we've got permission to go back in the spring and the fall with the same people. We made a lot of good PR there with local residents. They really loved us. Matter of fact, it was so awesome. One of the gals called us and said, "Could I bring my students over and let them see your equipment, what you guys are doing?" We said,
really?
Sure. And before we knew it, we had 2 buses of about 50 kids each coming from the high school, and we had a half a day there where we were like presenting a field trip.
Oh my
to
goodness.
the student body there of the Lee County High School. So, I mean, and then I ended up on the front page of the Montrose newspaper with the kids.
Oh,
so, I mean, we really touch the citizens there, and they love us, and you know, they know what we're doing. And you know, when a lot of them said, "Hey, it's about time somebody comes here." I turn up so much stuff in my field every year. I mean, the artifacts are thick in Lee County, Iowa. I'm here to tell you.
Wow.
So we really feel we're in the right place, and we just tell everybody we're looking for a Native American town from the ancient times, and that's how we position it. And we don't have to talk, you know, gospel or anything per se, but they know we're LDS, and if they want to talk gospel, we will.
Being a little PC, I guess, but still, nonetheless, a great missionary opportunity when it presents itself.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And now the scans we have numerous targets. I mean, I'd say we've probably got about 500 targets from our first 2 week of scan. And of course we can't go to all of them. And we've got over 100 samples right now. We have potentially about 24 roundhouses like the ones we found in Ohio. We haven't even touched those yet.
What's a roundhouse? Explain to the audience.
Okay, the Adena and the Hopewell, the homes that they built, they usually put them into a circle with posts, which leave a stain in the soil. It's called a post mold. And we see these in, you know, semicircles. Sometimes it's a complete circle. And we're picking up the houses that these people actually lived in. And then off that, we'll find a fire pit inside or outside the front door. So we even can find a privy, if you can imagine that. We recognize a privy.
Wow.
So it's really bizarre, but we're doing a lot of good. We're very excited about it. And in our exploring mode so far, I mean, we had our first 15 samples that went in let's see, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We had 10 of them came back. They were incorrect. They weren't. It wasn't enough material to draw off the isotopes to get the data for the carbon-14. So the 5 we got back, we had one. So we had two that were practically current. I mean, like 1950s. So that obviously it's no good. We had 2 that are right around 1000 AD plus or minus a couple hundred years. So you could say 800 BC or 1200 AD, depending how you want to swing. And then we had the one really good hit, a fire pit with clam for 225 BC.
Yeah, that clam. That was kind of like the little the diamond in the rough per se.
Well, yeah, we hit one spot. Of course, we know where that is, and we have our GPS set. There's a net over Iowa that's already been mapped by the state of Iowa, and you get this. Gosh, there's a name for it. It's like Glover. I can't remember the name of this little unit, but you walk out, you take a GPS reading on the ground, and then with this little hand unit, it pinpoints in this invisible net over Iowa, and you've got a mark in the sky. It's kind of like having like a cloud, like for the computer.
Yeah.
And so you can always come back there, and it'll put you within 3 inches of your original spot every time. So we have all of our spots are marked, so we feel very confident we can go back to any spot we want to. As our dates come in, we'll know exactly where we are, what field and which spots were good for us. But we realized through our first pass, we only went down 4 feet. We've got to go deeper, and I'm surprised at that. I was hoping we wouldn't go any deeper than 4 feet, but it looks like we got to go down to 4, maybe 5, maybe even 5.5, 6 feet to hit the actual what we call a horizon for the city of Zarahemla and this Nephite or this town.
Well, Wayne, I got 2 questions for you before
So we're
Jonathan on.
excited about that. And go ahead, fire away.
Well, one question from an audience participant was, do you have any idea how large the city of Zarahemla was in its heyday? And are we excavating, in a portion of it, or what? Give us a little orientation on that size and what you think, the Temple Mount, where it's located. Is that central to your dig? Anything along those lines?
Well, right now, going across from Nauvoo, what we believe is the potential for the Temple Mount area, that would be probably in 1/3 of the northern half of what we call the Bean. We feel pretty confident from there all the way to Montrose. We have found so far the heaviest concentration in that area. We have gone north of our temple location, and as we go north, it thins out rather quickly. So I can't say that's definitive. I can just say that's what we've seen so far. But again, we now realize we have to go deeper, because all these pinpoints we've taken for our core sampling have all been around the 4.5 foot area. So we've got to go deeper. And like I said, Dr. Lefgren, he right now is comparing our Zarahemla site to Novgorod in Russia, because there's a lot of parallels that are the same, and it's already online, so you can look that up at the zarahemla.site and check it out. It's a real good read.
Okay,
comparisons are amazing.
Let's talk about that, because I only gave a smidgen of your information, your magazine website, your blog. I think your blog does provide some updates, but I also mentioned that donations to that cause are certainly going to give people premier access to all the data that you produce. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is correct. Dr. Lefgren has a 501c3 that's available on site there for those that want to contribute. And of course, we take all, we appreciate it. This is all private funding. We don't have a university backing us up. We're doing this ourselves. And a lot of good members have stepped up to the plate. We raised $70,000 for last year's work that we did. And a lot of those donations were 50 and $10.
Really? Awesome.
Yeah, a lot of good people pitching in $5, $10, $50. So, I mean, if we had a couple of people with deep pockets that threw in, and that'd be really awesome, because we've got a lot to do, and how much we can do depends on the finances. that's just the way it is. That's reality.
Sure. Wayne, I hope I got to let you go, and I got to bring Jonathan on. But I want to say that thank you for jumping on like you did. I'm just glad that we're able to bring you on real time. I also want to encourage you to keep me abreast of when it is. I know you're going to do a rollout of all that evidence of your excavation. I think you're going to do a live event, and perhaps there's some things we can do to contribute or get people down to that event, or maybe even broadcast something along those lines. But we are really,
Yeah, I'd look to late April or May for some type of big rollout.
wow, awesome.
Okay.
All right, Wayne, I'm going to say farewell. Thanks for joining us. You're, of course,
Paul, my pleasure.
welcome to continue listening on. And I'm going to go ahead and see what I can do to bring Jonathan on board real quick here. Well, it's not as easy as I like it always to be. I got to go searching for Jonathan. Here he is. All right. And let's make him a co-host. And Jonathan, you are live. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's great to hear from Wayne.
Awesome.
One thing before I share the screen, I just want to mention that if people have questions, you can message them in and then we can address them. So we'll do that. So I'm going to share my screen here in a second, as soon as it's ready. And then we'll start doing the presentation. I'll pause partway through in case I notice questions coming in, so we can address some of those. That's one of the reasons you're here doing it live, is so you can ask questions. So
yes, indeed. So appreciate you doing that. I know that's not as easy as people might imagine, but I think you've got a view that enables you to respond. So if you have any challenges, let me know, and I'll try to intercede and do what I can to help facilitate.
okay, sounds good.
Thank you, sir.
So you should be able to see my screen, right?
I can see your screen and I can see the headshot. And when I talk, my headshot comes on. When you talk, your headshot's up in the top right-hand corner. So all is well.
All right. I'll leave the video on. I could turn it off, but I'll leave it on. Okay, so here is kind of a summary of what I wanted to talk about. And you can see the first picture here, the illustration is of Mormon doing the abridgment. The second one is Moroni coming to Joseph Smith. The third is Joseph Smith uncovering the plates. And finally, the published Book of Mormon. And the title I'm using is Between These Hills, and you'll see why that's an important phrase in a moment, but it's the case for the New York Cumorah. And today, Paul asked me to review what the prophets, scriptures, and evidence have to say about all this. So that's kind of the outline. I want to mention too that if anyone participating today would like a copy of this presentation, I'm happy to make it available to you. You just send an email to this mobominfo@gmail.com, and in the subject line, put in BTH, sorry about that, put in BTH February. And that's how we'll know to send you a link to this presentation. I'll repeat this at the end if you didn't write it down yet. Okay, some of the things that I'm going to cover today, Wayne touched on as well, but I still like to review these things. So for example, why study Cumorah in the first place? Sorry, my thing's automatically forwarding. And that is because of its evidence of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon. And this is the quotation that Wayne had mentioned from Zion's Camp. I'll just read it real quickly here in case you can't see it for those just listening. Joseph said, while traveling, well, this is an introduction from the church's webpage. It says, while traveling through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois with Zion's Camp in 1834, Joseph wrote to his wife, Emma, that they were wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and their bones as proof of its divine authenticity. So that's why I said one of the reasons we focus on these things is as evidence or proof of its divine authenticity. To give you an idea of where Zion's Camp was, this is the image that Wayne showed earlier from the late 1800s of the mounds in North America. Since then, many more have been discovered. This one shows you the area that they covered during Zion's camp. Up here in the yellow circle is where Heartland was, and they left from there, and it was on the banks of the Mississippi here, in the circle in green, that Joseph wrote that letter to Emma. So you can see some of the mounds and areas that they had been crossing that he called the plains of the Nephites, and the bones and things that they found in here were the evidence of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Now, another one of the teachings of the prophets, of course, was from section 128 in the Doctrine and Covenants. And he said, Joseph wrote, again, what do we hear? Glad tidings from Cumorah. Moroni, an angel from heaven, declaring the fulfillment of the prophets of book to be revealed. That revelation in section 128 originally was a letter that Joseph Smith wrote to the Latter-day Saints. It was published in the Times and Seasons in September of 1842. And here I circled the part, again, what do we hear? Glad tidings from Cumorah, that was in the Times and Seasons. Now, by the way, it's interesting that Joseph wrote this letter to the Latter-day Saints and had someone publish it, because he was not actively editing the Times and Seasons at this point, even though he was listed as the editor. That's a topic we could discuss if someone has a question. But so why did he write that? Why did he write about Cumorah? Well, the very year before, in 1841, his brother Don Carlos, who was the editor of the Times and Seasons at the time, published this article in the Times and Seasons. And here's what it looked like. And I'll just read part of it. It says that when one reflects on the fact that here between these hills, he was talking about the hill in New York, and there's a ridge a mile away to the west, the entire power and national strength of both the Jaredites and Nephites were destroyed. By turning to the pages in the Book of Mormon, it points out here that you will read Mormon's account of the last great struggle of his people as they were encompassed around this hill Cumorah. And it is, he said here, it is printed Amora, which was an error. And that's some of the early editions of the Book of Mormon misspelled it like that. But then he went on to say, in this valley fell the remaining strength and pride of a once powerful people, the Nephites, and so on. So this was the year before in the Times and Seasons, before Joseph's letter appeared. Now, it was Oliver Cowdery who wrote that article, who said it was a fact that the final battles took place there. Here's a picture I took with my drone a few years ago of the hill Cumorah. You can see in the foreground, there's the statue of the hill Cumorah. And Oliver said that a mile west, which is not the first line of trees, but the line of trees behind that, is about a mile west is another ridge of less height. And it was in this valley between these hills that the final battles of both the Jaredites and the Nephites took place. So I like to say this is the place. In Utah, there's a this is the place monument for the valley. I like to say that we should have a this is the place monument on the hill Cumorah in New York as well. Now, this is a key point here, because whoops, let me go back to this. The Cumorah being in New York does not determine other locations of the Book of Mormon. And the prophets have said this several times, that even though we know Cumorah is in New York, it doesn't have anything, or doesn't tell us specifically where other sites are. Now, Wayne has just talked to us about Zarahemla across from Nauvoo from section 125 in the Doctrine and Covenants. And that's, I agree with him about that, but others don't, and that's okay. The key is, if New York, if Cumorah is in New York, all these other possibilities are still open as far as what the prophets have told us. The small circle is kind of what we call the Heartland idea that Wayne has talked about. The larger orange one is some of the early brethren and members of the church believe Central America was involved with the Book of Mormon, but they didn't get into South America. Others thought this green line, which was the entire hemisphere, was the Book of Mormon. And I'm open to any of those ideas, provided we stick with Cumorah in New York. So again, why study Cumorah? Because of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon, but also to understand the text better and to understand the evidence. And those are the three areas we're going to talk about. Here is President Nelson, and he made this really important statement. He said, whoops, It's sliding through faster than I planned. I know that good inspiration is based on good information. So we want to focus on good information and let every member make up their own mind what they want to conclude. This is more information from the church's webpage. I have the link here. And it quoted D&C 88:118, and as all have not faith, seek ye diligently and teach one another words of wisdom. Yea, seek ye out of the best books words of wisdom. Seek learning even by study and also by faith. And the passage on the church's webpage says this is more than a simple exhortation to learn about the gospel. It's an invitation from the Lord to recognize that not all sources of knowledge are equally reliable. Seeking out of the best books does not mean seeking only one set of opinions. That's really important. But it does require, sorry, it's going too fast, but it does require us to distinguish between reliable sources and unreliable sources. The church places great emphasis on knowledge and the importance of being well informed about church history, doctrine, and practices. So that's a key point that we want to remember here. So what is good information? All of these sites on here you could find references to in church history. And Wayne mentioned some of those from that 1879 Book of Mormon with Orson Pratt's notes. He did talk about North America, but he also claimed that Lehi landed in Chile, that the Zarahemla was in Colombia. These were some of the early ideas. So when we look at this, what is good information? We have to ask ourselves, well, Cumorah was one of them here at the top, of course. And in fact, in my view, Cumorah is where you have to start. And so we have to ask, where is Cumorah? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's a picture of the hill Cumorah from the late 1800s with no trees on it. At the time of Joseph, it had a few trees, not as many as it does today. But Joseph Smith clearly, and Oliver Cowdery clearly taught that Cumorah was in New York. And these are some maps from the Joseph Smith papers to orient you. If you're not familiar with this geography, this is Western New York, south of Lake Ontario here. And then this is the Palmyra area of New York. And the map's a little hard to see probably, but in the town of Palmyra is where the Grandin print shop is, where the Book of Mormon was published. And then the Smith farmhouse and the cabin are about in the middle, and the hill Cumorah is here at the bottom. So that gives you an orientation of where the hill Cumorah is. These are the three sites here. We know that Joseph's contemporaries and successors consistently reaffirmed the New York Cumorah. And what changed between now and then? Remember, Wayne talked a little bit about the two Cumorahs theory. And so I want to explain a little of the history of how this happened so that we can appreciate what we need to do to fix the problem that we face today with this. In 1910, there was a book by Charles Shook, who was a critic of the whole Mormon thing, the Book of Mormon, the church, the reorganized church, all that. And he claimed there is no physical evidence for the Book of Mormon. And like you say here, the Book of Mormon and claims of the Mormons re-examined from the viewpoint of American archaeology and ethnology. And in response to this book, which had quite a reaction in the media, there was an LDS scholar named L.E. Hills, and he did his own kind of a study of the Book of Mormon and concluded that the entire Book of Mormon took place in Central America. And you may see this map. He published it in 1917. I have a copy of his book with this map in it. And he claimed that Cumorah was right here in Central America. You can see this is southern Mexico with Yucatan and so on. But L.E. Hills identified a mountain here as Cumorah. Now, the thing is, he was familiar with Joseph Smith's letter that became section 128 in our Doctrine and Covenants. It was a different section in his Doctrine and Covenants because he was in the reorganized church, but they still recognized the same revelation. And in response to this, he developed the theory that there are two Cumorahs. The real Cumorah, he said, is in southern Mexico, but the traditional Cumorah in western New York was just a false tradition based on speculation. That's what led to the development of the Mesoamerican, what I call M2C, Mesoamerican two Cumorahs theory. And I've come up with this little logo that I use when I discuss this theory, but this is where it originated. And so again, this was his idea of it. Well, after 1917, Joseph Fielding Smith was a church historian and an apostle, and he responded to it. He said, within recent years, there has arisen among certain students of the Book of Mormon a theory to the effect that within the period covered by the Book of Mormon, the Nephites and Lamanites were confined almost entirely within the borders of the territory comprising Central America and the southern portion of Mexico, which we just saw was this theory right here. This is what he was referring to. He said, this modernistic theory of necessity, in order to be consistent, must place the waters of Ripley-Uncombe and the Hill Cumorah someplace within the restricted territory of Central America, notwithstanding the teachings of the church to the contrary for upwards of 100 years. Because of this theory, some members of the church have become confused and greatly disturbed in their faith in the Book of Mormon. And so then he presented evidence to show that the Hill Cumorah really was in New York. Among other things, he cited letter 7, which Wayne mentioned is the one where Oliver Cowdery was talking about all this. But despite what President Smith said, LDS scholars adopted the RLDS theory of the Mesoamerica to Cumorahs. Today, the largest proponents of it are Book of Mormon Central. And it was founded by the people who followed John Sorensen. This is what John Sorensen wrote about the New York Cumorah in his book, Mormon's Codex. He said, there remain Latter-day Saints who insist that the final destruction of the Nephites took place in New York. In other words, there's me and Wayne and thousands of others of us, but there remain a few of us. And Brother Sorensen said, but any such idea is manifestly absurd. Hundreds of thousands of Nephites traipsing across the Mississippi Valley to New York, pursued, why, by hundreds of thousands of Lamanites, is a scenario worthy only of a witless sci-fi movie, not of history. So that's the approach of the scholars to the New York Cumorah at this point. Now, you should immediately see the illogic of this, because he's assuming that it all took place in Central America. And if you assume that, then it is unlikely that they would go all the way to New York. But that's taking it backwards, because in my view anyway, you start with what the prophets taught about New York and you figure out the geography from there, not the other way around. We'll talk about that a little bit more. As a result of this, though, this Book of Mormon Central logo has this Mayan glyph in it. You see it in red there. And that's because in their view, the four original languages of the Book of Mormon, or the scriptures, are Hebrew, Greek, Egyptian, and Mayan, because they believe the Book of Mormon was originally written in Mayan. And whenever you see this logo, you know that the people who published the book believe in the Mesoamerican thing and reject the New York Cumorah. As a result, they've adopted this map. I took this off of BYU Studies, where they put Cumorah there, just like L.E. Hills did in 1917. And then there's this more generic map that Brother Sorensen developed, and he again put Cumorah in that same area. This was not to be specific to Central America, because the big problem they face is that Central America, as you see here, is more of an east-west orientation, but the Book of Mormon talks about a north-south orientation. So they kind of rotate Central America to this, but they still put Cumorah there. Now, more recently, here the seminary and institutes have been teaching the youth of the church this geography, which again puts Cumorah down here in that same configuration as M2C, the Mesoamerican two Cumorahs theory. Although it doesn't show exactly Mesoamerica, that's definitely the idea it's conveying. And at BYU, they're using this map, which is a computer-generated map of a kind of a fantasy land that doesn't exist in the real world. And that's how they're teaching the kids the Book of Mormon. And they put Cumorah again in the same area where L.E. Hills did in 1917. And so because of this process, this has been underway for, I don't know, it started really about the time I was at BYU 30 or 40 years ago. And there's what I call the academic cycle. You have the groups at the top here, farms, the old farms, many of you may remember farms, Book of Mormon Central, Book of Mormon Archaeological Foundation, et cetera. they've rejected what the prophets have taught about the New York Cumorah, and they teach that to the students at BYU and CES. The students become artists, church employees. They develop arts, focus on Central America. They develop media, videos, and so on, blogs. And then that proves what the Book of Mormon Central and Farms were saying all along. So it's a process of teaching, students become, the students create, and then that proves. So it's a self-repeating cycle. It goes over and over and self-reinforces. And here's a good example of it. Many people in the church, apparently this is the most viewed series on Come Follow Me in the church today with Tyler and Taylor. I assume many of you know them here from their videos. And these are great guys. I know them personally. I really like them. But they keep teaching this Cumorah being in either a fantasy land or wherever it is, it's not in New York. They reject the New York Cumorah. And that's what's going out to people who follow these guys. So the other alternative is what I like to call Moronize America. And this is the idea that Cumorah is really in New York. And these are the rivers that form the boundaries between the Lamanites on the bottom in purple and the Nephites on the top in green. And there's today we're not going to go over all the geography and all the issues, that we're going to do a little overview of it, but Wayne has kind of introduced pretty much most of this anyway. I just like to give you a visual, high-level conception of where these lands were and how it fits what the Book of Mormon says. So, but we also want to not lose sight of what we're really talking about. And I go back to Joseph Smith. This is in the Wentworth letter that Wayne mentioned. And one little side note on the Wentworth letter I'll mention is Wayne had the quotation where Joseph said that the remnant of Lehi are the Indians that live in this country, if you remember that. Sorry, I got to go back to that. But when he said that, he was replacing the whole hemispheric idea that Orson Pratt had written. And it's a lot more analysis than we can go through here, but Joseph explicitly rejected that whole hemispheric geography as far as where the Lamanites live. Here he said, our missionaries are going to the different nations. No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. Persecutions may rage, mobs may combine, armies may assemble, calumny may defame, but the truth of God will go forth boldly, nobly, and independent till it has penetrated every continent, visited every clime, swept every country, and sounded in every year, till the purposes of God shall be accomplished. Now, this brings up something President Nelson taught, and I want to use this to keep us in perspective here as well. Speaking, I don't know why this is accelerating. Okay, speaking of the book's history and geography, President Nelson taught, interesting as these matters may be, in other words, history and geography, study of the Book of Mormon is most rewarding when one focuses on its primary purpose, to testify of Jesus Christ. By comparison, all other issues are incidental. And I think everyone on this broadcast agrees with that, but he does acknowledge that they are interesting issues. And it's worth spending our time to study them. We just don't want to lose focus that the primary purpose of the book is to testify of Christ. But as Joseph Smith said, the physical evidence is evidence of its divine authenticity. President Nelson also said, the choice to come into Christ is not a matter of physical location. It's a matter of individual commitment. All members of the church have access to the doctrine, ordinances, priesthood keys, and blessings of the gospel, regardless of their location. People can be brought to the knowledge of the Lord without leaving their homelands. And I think that's important for us to all remember. And I like to point this one out, that every nation today is a gathering place. This is a map, an older map of where temples are. There's been many added since, for example, in Thailand, India, and other areas in Africa. But these are places that my wife and I visited in the last year or so around the world, where we've run into fantastic, wonderful, faithful members of the church that have never even visited the United States or even the Americas. These are mostly in Asia. So we want to keep that in mind. The other thing is to keep in mind some perspective here. And that is that when an issue is important to us, we can have a distorted idea of how important the issue is to other people. When we look around, we realize a problem that we consider important is insignificant to others. And I like to give this example. Everyone can work, shop, learn, and play and participate in society regardless of their religious beliefs. You could have it standing in line at the store. You could have a Catholic, an atheist, a Hindu, a pagan, LDS, Baptist, or a Buddhist, all standing in line. Everybody's getting along in society, participating fully. Another way to look at this is, here's people that were waiting to go in on an open house, but let's say they were just waiting to go in the temple. If you did a poll of them, you could have some that believe in the New York Cumorah, some that believe M2C, and some that believe the BYU fantasy map. We can still all participate and be faithful members of the church, love and serve one another, etc., and have these different beliefs. So I want to keep all that in mind, that we avoid any kind of contention over this issue. It's more of an educational process than an argument. This one was kind of interesting too, because we were in Missouri and we came across the Hill Cumorah Restoration Branch. I think this is their only building. But that's just to show that we don't want to focus so much on one issue that we kind of start our own little group. Okay, and I don't think anybody here is doing that, but I just want to caution us that as important as it is to understand church history, as we saw, the church encourages us to study church history. We want to keep this in mind. So nevertheless, when someone says an issue is not important, that only means it's not important to them. When an issue is important to us, we can assume it is also important to at least some other people. And that's been my experience. You know, some people in the church say, well, the geography doesn't matter, it's not important. But to many people, it is very important. So getting back to this, when President Oliver Cowdery said it was a fact, no one disagrees with that because it's well documented in church history. It was republished over and over. It's even in Joseph Smith's personal history. He had it copied into his history. Anybody can read it right in the Joseph Smith papers. So that's a well-established fact that everybody agrees with. The debates over Book of Mormon geography are based on which assumption you accept. You can assume Oliver was wrong, and if Oliver was correct. It's just an A or B choice. You either pick one or the other. If you believe Oliver was wrong, then your bias confirmation leads you to interpret the text that way. You find selected quotations that confirm your bias, and then you find archaeology, anthropology, geology, geography, etc., to prove Oliver was wrong. But if you assume Oliver was correct, then your same bias confirmation applies. You can interpret the text, find quotations from the prophets, and archaeology, anthropology, geology, geography, etc., that confirms that bias. So it really boils down to whether Oliver Cowdery was right or wrong, and why Oliver said what he did. So the three reasons that I think Cumorah is in New York are these: the prophets, scriptures, and evidence. And we'll go through each one in some time here. Starting with the prophets. When you take all three of these, you have a complete whole, right? It's like a three-legged stool. You have the prophets, scriptures, and external evidence that all support the New York Cumorah. If you think Hill Cumorah is in Mexico or somewhere else not in New York, then you have two of the three. You can interpret the scriptures for that, and you can find external evidence to support it, but you can't find any teachings of the prophets to the effect that Cumorah is anywhere other than in New York. So you're really faced with this situation if you accept New York, this situation if you reject New York. And I'm going to show you how that works. So here's the Cumorah issue. The prophets teach. Intellectuals assess the teachings of the prophets for credibility and viability, and then the intellectuals develop better theories that they like. Believers in what the prophets teach assess the evidence to corroborate the teachings of the prophets. And then the believers discover better explanations. So in other words, the intellectual approach is to say, well, I'm not going to take the prophet's word for it. I'm going to see if they're credible and viable. But believers say, well, I'm going to start with what the prophets say and then find evidence to corroborate those teachings. And that's the approach that I've taken. Okay, so here's again Oliver Cowdery. We talked about this 1 mile west rises another ridge. We already looked at that one. For those interested, this is a book that I wrote. This is a book I've written. Oh, this one has my dialogue in it. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. This is a book that I wrote about Cumorah. That slide had my pre-recorded stuff on. I forgot about that. All right, so this is the thing that I haven't talked about before anywhere. So I want to cover this today. very carefully. And I might be going fast. I'm assuming most of you, having seen Wayne's presentation and other presentations, are familiar with a lot of this content that I've already gone through. So it's kind of a summary. But again, if you want the PowerPoints, you're welcome to just send an email and we'll send it to you. So why did Oliver Cowdery state it was a fact that Cumorah was in New York? That's a key question, because you'll have scholars. Everybody who has that logo I talked about on Book of Mormon Central says Oliver Cowdery was wrong about Cumorah, which is the majority of the intellectuals in the church, and because of the academic cycle, is probably the majority of most members. Here's what Lucy Mack Smith recorded. She recorded what Joseph told her, Moroni told him. And this is how she wrote it in her history. She said, now Joseph, by the way, this is a picture of Moroni. It's the earliest one I found. It's from, I think it was published in 1910, this early drawing of Moroni appearing to Joseph Smith. But Lucy said, now Joseph, beware, and when you get to the place, your mind will be filled with darkness and all manner of evil will rush into your mind to prevent you from keeping the commandments of God, that you may not succeed in doing his work. And you must tell your father this, for he will believe every word you say. The record is on a side hill on the hill of Cumorah, 3 miles from this place. Remove the grass and moss, and you will find a large flat stone. Pry that up, and you will find the record underneath it lying on 4 pillars of cement. Then the angel left him. So according to this, Joseph told his mother that Moroni identified the hill as Cumorah the very first time they met, that very first night. And you can read it for yourself in the Joseph Smith papers. Here's what it looks like. This is not in Lucy's handwriting because she dictated it, but this is the original manuscript that she dictated, and where she talked about it being in the hill of Cumorah. And again, the link's right here. Oliver Cowdery, who heard all this also directly from Joseph Smith and wrote it in these letters, explained it this way. He said, it's no easy task to describe the appearance of a messenger from the skies, but it may be well to relate the particulars as far as given. The stature of this personage was a little above the common size of men in this age. His garment was perfectly white and had the appearance of being without seam. He then proceeded and gave a general account of the promises made to the fathers, and also a history of the Aborigines of this country, and said they were literal descendants of Abraham. Now, do you recognize that? That's the same language that Joseph Smith used in the Wentworth letter when he said that the remnant of Lehi were the Indians who live in this country. He learned that directly from Moroni. It's a direct quote of what Moroni told him. Moroni went on to say, this history was written and deposited not far from that place. What was that place? It's where Joseph was living at the time, the Joseph home near Palmyra. So this is a really key phrase. Moroni told Joseph Smith that the history of these Aborigines of this country was written and deposited not far from that place. In other words, Mormon and Moroni wrote the Book of Mormon. Mormon wrote the abridged plates, and Moroni added to him with the Book of Ether and his own writings, not far from Joseph's own home. And here is the map that shows the Joseph Smith home, the log home, the frame home where they lived later. And then down at the bottom, you can see it's about a 3-mile walk to the hill Cumorah. And it was Moroni who told Joseph that it was just 3 miles away, roughly. So when Moroni told Joseph that the record was written and deposited not far from his home, this is what he was referring to. Here's another kind of a graphical illustration of where it is. You can see the downtown where the Four Corners churches are today. They didn't exist in Joseph's day, but then the temple is there in the middle next to the 21, but on the other side of the road below the 31 is where Joseph's home was, the farmhouse and the cabin, and then the hill Cumorah down about 3 miles away. So Oliver Cowdery went on to say that it was our brother's privilege, referring to Joseph, if obedient to the commandments of the Lord, to obtain and translate the same by the means of the Urim and Thummim, which were deposited for that purpose with the record. And so here's Joseph studying the characters, as he said he did. He said he studied the characters, he transcribed them onto paper, and he translated them with the Urim and Thummim. Now the next part is pretty interesting because while describing the place, this is Moroni again. While describing the place where the record was deposited, he gave a minute relation of it, and the vision of his mind being opened at the same time, he was permitted to view it critically. This is the vision of Joseph Smith's mind being opened. And it said, previously being acquainted with the place, he was able to follow the direction of the vision afterward, according to the voice of the angel, and obtain the book. So that's consistent with what Lucy wrote about him telling him that the record is on a hillside on the hill of Cumorah, 3 miles from this place. This is another photo I took with my drone to give you an idea of the relationship between where the farmhouse is. It's in the north, I'm looking south here, and the hill Cumorah off in the distance about 3 miles away. And if you remember, Lucy said that Moroni told Joseph, remove the grass and moss, and you will find a large flat stone, pry that up, and you will find the record under it lying on 4 pillars of cement. And that's exactly how Joseph described it. There were 4 pillars of cement underneath there. I really like this because, you know, some people say, well, if this stone was there, obvious all these years, someone would have moved it. But Moroni told him he had to remove the grass and moss that had grown over it, and then you would find the flat stone, a large flat stone, which to me implies that it was cut as a cover for this this stone box. It's almost like a tomb that Moroni built here, with a large flat stone on it, and then grass and moss growing on top of it, so it would be well concealed. Well, of course, this was the first time Joseph saw the plates. In the ensuing years, he returned every 4 years, and then he got married. He moved down to Harmony area in Pennsylvania, married Emma. They returned to Palmyra. This is the route going up, back to Palmyra. And then they were there in this is in roughly January of 1827. Now remember, he had not received the plates yet, because this was only the 4th year. He was going to receive the plates in September. He didn't know that yet, but in that January, this is again from Lucy's journal. Joseph returned with his wife in good health and fine spirits. Not long after this, his father had occasion to send him to Manchester on business. And as he started quite early in the morning, we expected at home at the outside by 6 o'clock in the evening. So just to give you an idea where Manchester is, the Smith home is in the top here near Palmyra. And then the hill Cumorah is about down 3 miles, as we said. And then the town of Manchester is south of that, a couple of miles. And this is a map of the modern locations, but they were the same in Joseph Smith's day. So just picture this, that their father sent Joseph down to Manchester on business, but he was coming home late. They expected him at 6 o'clock. When 6 came, he did not arrive. And Lucy wrote, we always had a peculiar anxiety about him whenever he was absent from us, for it seemed as if something was always taking place to jeopardize his life. But to return, he did not get home till the night was far spent. On coming in, he threw himself into a chair, apparently much exhausted. My husband did not observe his appearance and immediately exclaimed, Joseph, why have you stayed so late? Has anything happened to you? We have been much distressed about you these 3 hours. So it was roughly 9 o'clock when he came home after dark. Presently, he, Joseph, smiled and said in a very calm tone, I have taken the severest chastisement that I ever had in my life. My husband, supposing it was from some of the neighbors, was quite angry and observed, I would like to know what business anybody has to find fault with you. Stop, Father, stop, said Joseph. It was the angel of the Lord. As I passed by the hill of Cumorah, where the plates are, the angel met me and said that I had not been engaged enough in the work of the Lord. Now, this is really amazing if you think about it. First of all, she put it in direct quotes. Sometimes Lucy would paraphrase things, but other times she remembered exactly what people said. And she remembered that he said when he came home from Manchester, that he was passed by the hill of Cumorah where the plates are. So once again, he knew the name of the hill before he even got the plates to translate him. He did not learn the name of Cumorah from the translation. He learned it directly from Moroni. And Wayne mentioned that Parley Pratt talked about that. David Whitmer also said that Joseph learned the name of the hill from Moroni directly, not from reading the translation. So this is pretty cool, I think. It's another way to show us how Moroni taught Joseph Smith, educated him about what was happening and about the Nephites. But for purposes of today, most significantly, Moroni is the one who told him the name of the hill. And that's what it was called anciently. So Moroni went on to tell Joseph that the time had come for the record to be brought forth, and that Joseph, this is Joseph first person, that I must be up and doing and set myself about the things which God had commanded me to do. But Father, continued he, give yourself no uneasiness concerning the reprimand that I have received. In other words, don't worry about me getting in trouble with Moroni, for I now know the course that I am to pursue, so all will be well. And then Lucy put this comment in there. It was also made known to him at this interview that he should make another effort to obtain the plates on the 22nd of the following September, but this he did not mention to us at that time. That shows you how solid her memory was, that she remembered that he knew this, but he didn't tell us at the time, he told us later. And I like this picture too. This was from many years ago when there was topiary on top of the hill Cumorah that spelled out the name Cumorah. And then one last picture, just for historical reference. This is looking north from the hill Cumorah towards the Smith farm. This was again in the late 1800s, this picture was taken. And today there's a lot more trees and more houses and things, but this is what it looked at that time. So based just on that, on Joseph Smith's own explanation or expression about what Moroni told him, Oliver Cowdery was completely justified in saying it was a fact that the hill Cumorah is in New York, right? I mean, it was Moroni himself told Joseph that. But we can ask, why else did Oliver Cowdery state that it was a fact? Here's what the Book of Mormon says. This is Mormon in Mormon 6:6. I made this record, talking about the abridged plates, out of the plates of Nephi, and hid up in the hill Cumorah all the records which had been entrusted to me by the hand of the Lord, save it were these few plates which I gave to my son Moroni. So from this we can learn, if you read back, I won't take the time to go through the scriptures, but Mormon said that he had the entire repository of records of the Nephites. And he had to move them from the hill Shem over to the hill Cumorah before the final battle. And he made the record out of the plates, out of this repository of records, and he hid all those records in the hill Cumorah. So the question is, where is the hill Cumorah that he was talking about? And this gets back to the question, is it somewhere in southern Mexico or is it in New York? So let's see. Remember, Oliver Cowdery said it was a fact, it was in New York. Moroni said the hill where Joseph got the plates was named Cumorah. And yet many scholars say they were wrong. Let's look at that. So the hill Cumorah in New York is the place where Mormon put the Nephite records repository. And here's how we can tell that. The repository contained the Nephite records as well as the sword of Laban and other Nephite artifacts. Is the repository of Nephite records there in New York? Well, let's see. Moroni, we know that Moroni buried the plates in the stone and cement box he built on the hill Cumorah. But Orson Pratt explained that. He said he was without doubt, Moroni was without doubt, inspired to select a department of the hill separate from the great sacred depository of the numerous volumes hid up by his father. And this was in the Millennial Star and other places where he wrote this. Here's how Orson Pratt explained it. The prophet Mormon, father of Moroni, had been entrusted with all the sacred records of his forefathers engraved on metallic plates. New plates were made by Mormon on which he wrote the abridgment. These new plates were given to Moroni to finish the history, and all the ancient plates Mormon deposited in Cumorah about 384 years after Christ. When Moroni, about 36 years after, made the deposit of the book entrusted to him, in other words, the abridged plates, he was without doubt inspired to select a department of the hill separate from the great sacred depository of the numerous volumes hid up by his father. The particular place in the hill where Moroni secreted the book was revealed by the angel to Prophet Joseph Smith. But the grand depository of all the numerous records of the ancient nations of the Western continent was located in another department of the hill. And here's how you can visualize that. There are two separate departments of the hill Cumorah in New York. Moroni's plates, the abridged plates he put in the stone box, and Mormon's repository of all the records in this other room. Now, some years ago, one of the scholars at BYU who teaches Mesoamerica asked me this question. He said, well, if the whole repository was in the hill Cumorah, then why would Moroni have to put him in a stone box? Why didn't he just have Joseph Smith go into the repository? I think the answer is pretty obvious. If you remember, Lucy said that the very first night, Moroni told Joseph Smith that he was going to be tempted by the treasure. He was going to, and Oliver Cowdery elaborated more about that, but it took him 4 years to overcome the temptation of the gold in the stone box, which is just one set of plates. He thought maybe there was other artifacts in there that he could sell, or maybe he could sell some of the gold. And it took him 4 years to overcome that temptation. The idea of walking into a repository full of records, it'd be hard for anybody to overcome that temptation of revealing the source, taking gold out, whatever. Furthermore, if you think about it, he had to translate just the abridgment, not the original records. Originally, he was not going to translate any original records. If he had walked into the repository, either Moroni would have to meet him, or he'd have to tell him which of these piles of plates was the ones he was supposed to translate. So it just would have been impractical for Moroni to send Joseph Smith into this repository at the beginning. Instead, give him the abridgment, let him become familiar with that, translate that, and then return it. And here's how we know this all took place. This again is from Orson Pratt. The significance of the hill, no, this is from another author, I guess. The significance of the Hill Cumorah in the restoration of the gospel goes beyond its identification as the ancient repository of the metal plates known as the Book of Mormon. The hill was not only a place where Joseph removed the plates, but also their final repository of all the sacred treasures and records of the Nephites.
Jonathan?
Now, yeah?
Just a quick question that was submitted, and it intrigues me as well. Is there any possibility at all that the library might, or a portion of it might be still in the Hill Shem? Is there any reason to suspect that?
Well, a lot of people suspect that, but if you know church history, you know they're not there anymore, because David Whitmer was specifically asked that question. He said, where is this repository? Well, they said, where are the plates? And he said, they're in New York. And they said, are they in the Hill Cumorah? And he said, no, but they're not far from there. And I'll show you that in just a minute. What we think happened is, I'll just explain it real quick. That's a great question. I get it a lot. And when David Whitmer, well, Oliver Cowdery also said that the plates are no longer in the Hill Cumorah, but David Whitmer said they're not only not there, but they're not far from there. And in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith was asked where the plates are. You know, some people have this theory that they were transported, you know, to outer space or another part of the world or whatever. And Joseph Smith said they're still in New York also. And so as I show you this quotation from Brigham Young, he alludes to the possibility that there were many wagon loads of plates. And Heber C. Kimball said there was more plates than a 6-mule team could carry or haul. And so what some of us think is that Joseph and Oliver, recognizing that people were, well, let me back up a minute. When Joseph first got the plates, other people were trying to steal them, right? And Joseph would tell people, well, I don't really have plates. It's a bag of sand. He was doing everything he could to deflect people from searching for the plates. And once he moved down to Harmony, the whole thing kind of died down. But they knew that once they published the Book of Mormon with the testimony of 11 people who had seen actually the plates and talking about them coming out of the Hill Cumorah, that there would be treasure hunters digging up the hill all over the place. David Whitmer called them the adventurers from Rochester, because there was a particular group coming out of Rochester that came down to dig up the hill. And early people said, yeah, you could see them up at night with lanterns digging, because nobody owned this property. I mean, the landowner wasn't letting people do this, but people would go up at night with lanterns and dig holes. And there's lots of holes all over the Hill Cumorah. So what we think happened is, and David Whitmer said, he said, those adventurers from Rochester will never find them, because they're no longer in the Hill Cumorah, but they're not far from there. So what we think happened is that Joseph Oliver and maybe Joseph's brothers helped move all those records back to the Hill Shem, or to another location, but most likely back to the Hill Shim. And the reason is that the Hill Shim had a built-in repository where all the Nephites kept these records. And that's why Ammoron told Mormon when he was 25 years old to go to the Hill Shim. If you remember that, that's because that was the repository, which Mormon did. But then later he had to move all those records to the Hill Cumorah. And I think the reason he moved them to the Hill Cumorah was he knew the Jaredites had an ancient fortress there that he could use as a storage place. We're getting a little off topic, but it's a great question. I love to talk about. And so if Joseph and Oliver realized, of course, pursuant to the direction of the Lord, that people were going to be digging up the Hill Cumorah even more once the Book of Mormon was published, it made sense for them to move all those records back to the Hill Shim. So that's what I think happened. And some of you may have heard about the room that was discovered in the Hill Cumorah. I have pictures of it in another presentation. If we have time at the end, I could show you that. But it was they dug into this room on the top of the Hill Cumorah, and it was completely empty, but otherwise it perfectly matched the description that I'm going to show you here in just a minute.
Well, thanks. Move on. Go ahead. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah, I don't want to deter people from asking questions by giving long-winded answers. So I'll move on. Okay, Mormon's depository in Cumorah. This is the one that Wayne alluded to. So I'm just going to show you the whole quotation. Anybody can look it up in the Journal of Discourses if you want, or on the web pages I'm going to show you. He said, this is significant too, because this was 2 months before Brigham Young died. And after this sermon, he gave only one other sermon. So it was the next to the last sermon. He knew he was going to die. He'd been sick for almost a year. He was concerned about dying and leaving the priesthood organized and clarifying everything. And this is one of the things he said. I relate this to you, and I want you to understand that I take this liberty of referring to these things so they will not be forgotten and lost. Oliver Cowdery went with the prophet Joseph when he deposited these plates. Joseph did not translate all the plates. There was a portion of them sealed, which you can learn from the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. When Joseph got the plates, the angel instructed him to carry them back to the Hill Cumorah, which he did. Now think about that, though. That contradicts what Joseph Smith history says, because when Joseph left Harmony, he said he met the messenger and he gave the plates back. Brigham Young here is saying the angel told him to take him back to the Hill Cumorah. So if you don't understand church history a lot, you can see this as a conflict, but it's not a conflict at all, because really at least the way I interpret the history is there were two different sets of plates, and we don't have time to talk about that today, but it can be confusing if you read this and you don't understand that Joseph took the plates of Nephi back to the Hill Cumorah, but the abridged plates he gave to the messenger when he was finished with them in Harmony. That's what this is referring to. So then he says, Oliver says that when Joseph and Oliver went there, the hill opened and they walked into a cave in which there was a large and spacious room. He says he did not think at the time whether they had the light of the sun or artificial light, but that it was just as light as day. Now, when I was younger, I always thought this meant that the hill opened like an elevator door or something. But this room that was discovered opened from the top. It had like a trap door thing on it, so you could close it, cover it with branches and brush and stuff so that it wouldn't be found. So when he says the hill opened, in that sense, it makes sense. And they walked in or climbed into this cave. And cave sounds like a natural cave, but he didn't say that. Back in that day, a cave was any type of a cavern, whether man-made or not. And the room in the Hill Cumorah was built up with cut stones. Okay, so they laid the plates on the table. It was a large table that stood in the room. Under this table, there was a pile of plates as much as 2 feet high. There were altogether in this room more plates than probably many wagon loads. They were piled up in the corners and along the walls. I tell you this is coming not only from Oliver Cowdery, but others who were familiar with it and who understood it just as well as we understand coming to this meeting. In other words, it was not some vision of a hill in Mexico. It was a literal event. Don Carlos Smith, Joseph's younger brother, was a young man of as much veracity as any young man we had, and he was a witness to these things. Samuel Smith saw some things, Hiram saw a good many things, but Joseph was the leader. So Don Carlos Smith, unfortunately, died in Nauvoo in 1841. and he didn't leave many records at all of what his experiences, but Brigham Young said he was another witness to these things. Now, the other interesting thing I didn't put in here is that David Whitmer also said that Oliver told him about going into the repository in Cumorah. So it wasn't just Brigham Young. Here's what Heber C. Kimball said. There was a discussion about the handcart pioneers, and he said, how does it compare with the vision that Joseph and others had when they went into a cave in the hill Cumorah and saw more records than 10 men could carry? There were books piled up on tables, book upon book. Those records this people will yet have if they accept the Book of Mormon and observe its precepts and keep its commandments. Now, usually the quotation stops there and people focus on the word vision, saying, how does it compare with the vision that Joseph and Oliver had? So it must have been a vision. But here's the rest of what he said. I mentioned these few things by way of contrast with the handcart operation. They are the events that I've heard Joseph speak of time and time again. So Heber C. Kimball heard Joseph talk about this. It wasn't just Oliver Cowdery who talked about this. And when he said the vision, it means it's a synonym for saying the view or the spectacle or however you want to say it, when they walked into this room and saw all these records and artifacts. Heber C. Kimball talked familiar to the brethren about Father Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and others. Now, this was Joseph's father also walking in, and others walking into the hill Cumorah and seeing records upon records piled upon tables. And they walked from cell to cell and saw the records that were piled up. Now, that's an interesting comment because, and this is anecdotal, I haven't seen it myself, but I'm told that when they constructed the statue of Moroni on top of the hill Cumorah back in the 1930s, when they dug the foundation, they broke into empty chambers. And at the time, they didn't think anything of it. They just filled it with cement so they could build the statue up on top. But here, Heber C. Kimball said that there were cell to cell. In other words, it wasn't just one room. There was multiple rooms, which you would expect from the military fortress that the Jaredites built. So it all fits together here. Then Wilford Woodruff said, this is from his journal, President Young said in relation to Joseph Smith returning the plates of the Book of Mormon that he did not return them to the box from whence he had received them, but he went into a cave in the hill, Cumorah, that's how he spelled it, with Oliver Cowdery and deposited those plates upon a table or shelf. In that room were deposited a large amount of gold plates containing sacred records. Joseph Smith said, now this is Joseph Smith, not just Oliver Cowdery. Joseph Smith said that cave contained tons of choice treasures and records. Now here's another one. This is Elizabeth Kane, who was the wife of General Kane, who protected Joseph Smith and the saints and so on. She did a visit to Utah and wrote about her experiences. And she asked people, well, I asked where the plates are now and saw in a moment from the expression of the countenances around that I had blundered. You weren't supposed to ask about that. But I was answered that they were in a cave, that Oliver Cowdery, though now an apostate, would not deny he had seen them. He had been to the cave. Brigham Young's tone was so solemn that I listened bewildered like a child to the evening witch stories of its nurse. Brigham Young said that when Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith were in the cave this third time, so they went at least three times, they could see its contents more distinctly than before. It was about 15 feet high, and round its sides were arranged boxes of treasure. In the center was a large stone table, empty before, but now piled with similar gold plates, some of which lay scattered on the floor beneath. Here's another one that heard Brigham Young at an evening meeting in Cedar City describe an apartment in the hill Cumorah that some of the brethren had been permitted to enter. He said there was a great wealth in the room and sacred implements, vestments, arms, precious metals, and precious stones, more than a 6-mule team could draw. Here's another one. This is attending meeting, a discourse from W.W. Phelps. He related a story told him by Hiram Smith, which was as follows. Joseph, Hiram, Cowdery, and Whitmer went to the hill Cumorah. Now he says Whitmer, and this is interesting because David never said that he went in there, but he said Oliver told him that he had. And if you remember, two of the Whitmer brothers plus a brother-in-law, Hiram Page, were witnesses of the 8 plates. And so when it says Joseph, Hiram, Cowdery, and Whitmer, it could have been John Whitmer or Christian Whitmer, went to the hill Cumorah. And again, as many of you know, that I think that Joseph was returning the plates of Nephi that he showed to the 8 witnesses. And this would make sense because there's 4 of the 8 witnesses right there returning to the hill of Cumorah. As they were walking up the hill, a door opened, again, from the top opened up, and they walked into a room about 16 feet square. In that room was an angel and a trunk. On that trunk lay a Book of Mormon, gold plates, Laban's sword, Aaron's breastplate. Okay, then the next one, this is the one I mentioned from David Whitmer. Edward Stevenson told him this. It was likewise stated to me by David Whitmer in the year 1877 that Oliver Cowdery told him that the prophet Joseph and himself had seen this room, and that it was filled with treasure, and on a table therein were the breastplate and the sword of Laban, as well as a portion of the gold plates not yet translated, and that these plates were bound by 3 small gold rings, and would also be translated, as was the first portion in the days of Joseph. When they are translated, much useful information will be brought to light. That's totally an understatement, right? But till that day arrives, no Rochester adventurer shall ever see them or the treasures, although science and mineral rods testify that they are there. But the grand repository, this is Orson Pratt. Okay, I skipped over the part. There was a different interview where he said they are no longer in Cumorah, but they're not far from there. I didn't put that in here. Okay, here's Orson Pratt. The grand repository of all the numerous records of the ancient nations of the Western continent was located in another department of the hill. So that's one we kind of talked about before. So here we get back to Oliver Cowdery. When he said it was a fact that the final battles of the Jaredites and Nephites took place at the hill Cumorah, Western New York, he had 2 reasons. One, Joseph told him that what Moroni had said originally, but Oliver accompanied Joseph to the repository in the hill multiple times. So how could he not say it was a fact? He could read the Book of Mormon. Mormon said he buried all the records, or concealed, whatever, all the records in the hill Cumorah. Oliver went in there, he saw all the records in that same hill. So of course it was. And of course, that's what Joseph meant in section 128 when he wrote that letter about glad tidings from Cumorah. All right, so people ask me all the time, where's all these references? And if you go to, hopefully everybody here is familiar with the Museum of the Book of Mormon, the online museum, which we just abbreviate as MOBOM, Museum of Book of Mormon.org. You can go to this webpage, and at the very top, there's a menu. And if you look at the menu on here, it says Home, Book of Mormon Quiz, Contact, Evidences, Teachings, Origins, and Cumorah Overview. If you click on Cumorah Overview, it gives you all the references about Cumorah. Not all of them, but a lot of them, the ones I've talked about here and others. And also, if you go there, there's a place where you can subscribe to the newsletter, and then you can get updates from me and even from Wayne and other people that talk about what's going on with Book of Mormon evidences. We're not covering the excavations and things in the Zarahemla site here, because this is more for the world as a whole rather than just for people involved with Zarahemla. But other things that are published, we cover here. All right, all that is to cover what the prophets have taught. Now let's talk about the scriptures. I guess we still have a little bit of time here. So let's see. Again, here's the overview of the geography with Cumorah in New York. People ask me all the time, how do you explain this geography? When I read the Book of Mormon, it sounds like there's one narrow neck of land and 2 big lands. So I'm just going to give a really, really quick summary here. First off, if you read carefully, I didn't put the citation, so you have to look at it on your own. There's a sea west south. We always talk about the sea west, but it specifies sea west or west sea, but it also says there's a sea west south, which means, in my opinion, that there's 2 sea wests, one south, one north. So that's the sea west south. The head of Sidon, we're going to talk about that in a minute because it's really important in understanding this whole geography. Sidon River that flows by Nauvoo there. The sea east, the narrow neck of land up here, the sea west north up here, because a sea is, well, again, I don't have time to get into the detail, but the term sea in Hebrew is translated in the Bible, means either a mighty river a large, what we would consider a lake, like the Sea of Galilee, or an ocean. It has all those meanings. It just means many waters, basically. And then finally, the small neck would be up here. Now, we don't have time to go through all the description in the scriptures of the Book of Mormon, but I want to give you one example. Hey, Paul, are you there?
Yes, I am.
So I need to get an idea how much time I have so I know how to gauge this.
I'm glad you asked. It's 2:45, and we may not have an extensive Q&A at the end. So I would say you've got at least 30 minutes, perhaps
Okay.
45.
30 or how long? 35?
30. You just go and I'll cut you off. No.
Okay. Well, the reason is, for example, I mean, I could talk about any one of these topics for an hour, so I have to gauge it. And I really want to respond to any questions that come up here. So maybe I should stop here. Are there any other questions that people have that are burning, or should I just proceed?
Well, I tell you what, let's give it a few seconds. And if any questions are chatted in, I did invite everyone through chat to feel free to submit questions, and we had one, so we addressed
Okay.
that. If they come in, I'll let you know, but let's just
Perfect.
press on.
Okay. All right. This one I think is pretty cool because this head of the river is, you know, they say the difference between Catholics and Protestants is a punctuation, a comma in one verse in the scriptures. And in a sense, you could say the difference between Heartland and Mesoamerica or Baja or Peru, all the others, is the head of the river. What does the head of the river mean? And here's the question. What does that phrase mean? The key to understand, sorry, skipping around. The key to understanding the geography of the Book of Mormon is to understand the meaning of the phrase head of the river Sidon. It leads directly to the identity of the river, and everything else flows from there. No pun intended, right? So does it mean the headwaters, or does it mean a confluence? And I'll show you here some of the verses from the Book of Mormon to show why this is important. This is in Alma 22. I'm going to skip down to where it's highlighted in red. But it says the borders of the wilderness, which was on the north by the land of Zarahemla, through the borders of Manti, by the head of the river Sidon, running from the east towards the west. And then it skips down and says, the Nephites had taken possession of all the northern parts of the land bordering on the wilderness at the head of the river, Sidon, from the east to the west, round about the wilderness side. So that's a very confusing passage that people have written. Let me skip back to that people have written all kinds of books and articles and everything about. But the gist of it is that the head of the river Sidon is south of Zarahemla on a river. And so if the headwaters are on the north, then it flows south. If the head of the river means a confluence, then it's on the south. And I'm sorry, I had it backwards. Well, I'll show you a diagram here. You can see it better than me just talking about it. Okay. Here's a passage from First Nephi that people refer to understand what the head of the river is. Nephi, during his dream, said, and as I cast my eyes round about, that perhaps I might discover my family also, I beheld a river of water, and it ran along, and it was near the tree of which I was partaking the fruit. And I looked to behold from whence it came, and I saw the head thereof a little way off. And at the head thereof I beheld your mother Sariah, etc. And then later down in verse 17, he says, and it came to pass that I was desirous that Laman and Lemuel should come and partake of the fruit also. Wherefore I cast mine eyes toward the head of the river that I might see them. So what does that mean? All it says is, he looked towards the head of the river from whence it came. Here's two alternatives. If you had a confluence, you can see on the picture on the left here, the river is coming from both sides, and then it's coming towards the viewer. That's a confluence. The other one on the right is a single river coming from a small bunch of tributaries, which would be the headwaters flowing towards him. And all Lehi said was, I looked to behold from whence it came, and I saw the head thereof a way off. At the head thereof I beheld your mother. It could be either one. It could either be a confluence or headwaters. Now this might sound a little too detailed, but it really is the key to this whole geography puzzle. The head of the river Sidon is south of the city of Zarahemla, like I said before. If the head of the river Sidon means headwaters, then Sidon starts in the south and flows north past the city of Zarahemla. If the head of the river Sidon means a convergence, then Sidon flows south past the city of Zarahemla toward the convergence. So the land of Nephi is south of the land of Zarahemla and also higher in elevation. We can tell that from the book, the text. This implies the north, wait, let me go back. This implies a north flowing river, which may or may not be Sidon. That's a key point. We know there is a river that flowed from the land of Nephi down to the land of Zarahemla. It flowed north, but it doesn't say that that was the river Sidon. All we know is that the river that flowed past Zarahemla was the river Sidon. So there's two separate issues. What does the head of the river Sidon mean? And second, is there a river flowing north from the land of Nephi to the land of Zarahemla? Let's take the second one first. Is there a river flowing north from the land of Nephi down to the land of Zarahemla? Yes, there is, both in Mesoamerica and in North America. And this is really mind-blowing that people never thought of this before. But here in Mesoamerica, you can see there's a Umasita and the Grijalva River. They both flow north. In North America, the Tennessee River flows north. And, you know, I think what happened is most of the Book of Mormon scholars who have looked at this live in Utah, and they don't even know about the Tennessee River because it's a major river that flows north in North America. And amazingly, it's not amazing to Wayne and I and the rest of us, but amazingly, it flows from what we think is the land of Nephi, which is the Chattanooga area of Tennessee. It flows north to the land of Zarahemla, which is Illinois. Now notice it doesn't flow all the way north to the city of Zarahemla. But the first time the Book of Mormon ever mentions the city of Zarahemla is in Alma. The whole book of Mosiah just talks about the land of Zarahemla. So the city developed later. It wasn't where Mosiah went originally. First, he landed in the land of Zarahemla. They went up the river until they met what was a town or a village or whatever community of Zarahemla. But it wasn't a city of Zarahemla until much later. So when in Omni, when it says they left from the land of Nephi and went to the land of Zarahemla, they went north along a river to the land of Zarahemla, just like it shows on this map. So both Mesoamerica and North America have north flowing rivers from land of Nephi, proposed land of Nephi, to the proposed land of Zarahemla. So that's a wash. People have consulted dictionaries and reference books to justify both source or headwaters and confluence. There's no definitive answer. In my opinion, it's all bias confirmation anyway, except for one thing. And this is really awesome. This gets back to another issue that I wish we had time to discuss. That is that if Joseph Smith didn't really translate the plates, most of you here know about this idea that he didn't really translate. He just read words off a stone in a hat, which I called Sith, or stone in the hat theory. If he didn't really translate the plates, then his environment and his language is irrelevant to this issue. In other words, there's no point even looking in a dictionary because it wasn't his words. On the other hand, if Joseph really did translate the plates with the Urim and Thummim, as he and Oliver always said he did, which I believe he did, the prophets taught he did, the scriptures say he did, then his environment and his language is highly relevant because every translator can only use words from their own mind, right? The Lord has to draw on things. Remember, the Spirit or the Holy Ghost will bring things to our recollection. And that's what happens with Joseph translated. The Spirit brought words and phrases to his recollection as he translated the Nephite original records. So I think Joseph Smith's environment is highly relevant. If you believe that he didn't really translate anything, that he just read the stone in the hat, then whatever you want to believe is fine because we have no idea where that language would have come from. But if you believe what Joseph and Oliver said and the prophets, that Joseph really translated the plates with Urim and Thummim, then his language and his environment is highly relevant to this. So what does the head of the river mean? Now, this is a map of the Susquehanna River. And it shows the upper Susquehanna subbasin up in headwaters. It's actually, the headwaters are not far from Cooperstown, New York, the Hall of Fame up there. And it flows down towards the Atlantic, goes down through Delaware. But the bottom is the south, where towards the Atlantic, the top is the headwaters. So here's, I just did the map. I'll do that again so you can see how it flows. See how it starts in the top and comes to the south, goes towards the Atlantic. Now the dark line here is the border between New York and Pennsylvania. Now it just so happens the Susquehanna River flows through Broome County, which is where Harmony, Pennsylvania was. And that's the Priesthood Restoration site. Broome County's in New York, but Harmony is just on the other side of the border in Pennsylvania. But the Susquehanna River flows through Broome County and Harmony, Pennsylvania. Just that little teeny bit there, you can see where the red dot is on the south, Harmony. The red dot on the north is Binghamton in New York. So there's just that little bit of it that flows through Pennsylvania right there. Here it goes flowing down. You can see how that works. So what's significant about Harmony, Pennsylvania? Well, here's the restoration of the home where Joseph and Emma lived when he translated most of the Book of Mormon. This is where he translated all of the abridged plates from the Book of Lehi, which was lost, 116 pages, and then from the Book of Mosiah all the way through the end of Moroni and the title page, which was the last leaf of the plates. He translated all that here with Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and then Emma and some other scribes. This is what the Susquehanna River looks like. I think this was in September I was there. Here's me filming. One of my sons took a picture of me doing some filming there for a video I'm still working on, but here's the placard there. And this is really interesting. The church put this sign up. It says, cutting through this valley is the great bend of the Susquehanna River, one of the oldest rivers in the world. In the early 19th century, river boatmen navigated vessels laden with lumber and other goods to urban markets, such as Philadelphia. This river went all the way down to Philadelphia, but settlers typically cleared the riverbanks, leaving open fields for grazing cattle and sheep. Joseph and Emma's property extended to the river's midpoint. During spring floods, the water rose enough to cover the area just ahead of this marker. Hundreds of boats and rafts floated by in a single day. So this part here, this was late in the year, but back then in the spring, this would be all flooded. So it goes on, it's about 20 miles upriver from Binghamton is where Harmony is. You can see it here. Again, the river's flowing through. So the distance between those two red dots is about 20 miles. Now, this is all important because of Jonathan Edwards. Those of you who have heard me talk about this before know what I'm talking about, but for people that it's new, let me just explain it real quickly. Jonathan Edwards was the most famous theologian in America in the early 1700s, and he wrote a lot of books. So he was very prolific. Included in these books were an 8-volume set that was on sale in Palmyra starting in 1818 or so. And Joseph would visit that bookstore every week to get the newspaper for his father. And so as I started going through the non-biblical language that's in the Book of Mormon, I kept coming across Jonathan Edwards. And now I've written this book about it because I'm convinced that Joseph was familiar with Jonathan Edwards' works and he incorporated them as he was doing the translation. It's a topic for another day, but the point is that in his writing, we find out what the phrase head of the river means. And it's, this is a letter that he wrote, or no, this is the history. This is an introduction to the letter. And it says, after mid-April 1755, Gideon Hawley returned to Onaqua, the Indian settlement near modern Binghamton, New York, taking with him Edward's son, Jonathan Jr., so Jonathan Jr. Edwards. The lad was not quite 10, but is already speaking Mohican with his friends at school and play. And the reason for this is Jonathan Edwards was a missionary to the Lamanites, literally. He lived among the Indians, and he sent his son to school there so that he could learn the Indian language, so he could be a missionary to them when he grew older. And just as a sidelight, Jonathan Jr. grew up as a linguist, and he compared Hebrew to the Indian languages and found many similarities along the lines of what Wayne was talking to us about earlier. And he actually corresponded with George Washington about this. And George Washington referred him to a scholar in Europe that was interested in the same topic. I mean, there's a whole thread of fascinating history there. But getting back to this, here's the letter that Jonathan Edwards wrote to his son. There is a comfort to us that the same God that is here is also a Nakwaga, and that though you are out of our sight and out of our reach, you are always in God's hands, who is infinitely gracious, and we can go to him and commit you to his care and mercy. So they had sent their 10-year-old son to this Indian settlement with this other guy, Gideon Hawley. And then in a 1751 letter that Jonathan Edwards wrote to his supporters in England, he said, there has been here the last summer a man whose name was Jonah from Onondaga, this town near Binghamton. He says, a town of the Oneidas. The Oneidas was the Indian tribe in that area, situated on the Susquehanna River near the head of the river. That's the Book of Mormon phrase, the head of the river Sidon. Near about 200 miles southwest from Albany. He was one of the principal inhabitants of the town who, having heard of the things which we're doing here for the instruction of the Indians, came to visit this place and make report to his people. Okay, so let me summarize that again. Onondaga, however you pronounce it, was near Binghamton. His son was there, and he said it was located near the head of the river, about 200 miles southwest from Albany. So here's our map. You can see here the river's flowing down.
I'm sorry. I will take care of that, Jonathan.
What's that?
A little noise distraction there. Someone made it out.
Someone did mute. Okay. Well, I think I covered that before that came up.
Okay.
So what does the word head of the river mean? Here's on the map I showed you before. If you look up at where it says headwaters, Albany is up in that area. That's the capital of New York. It's 200 miles away. The head of the river, he said, was where Binghamton is. Now, if you look at this map, it's pretty obvious that the head of the river, the way Jonathan Edwards used it, does not mean the headwaters. It means something else. So we're going to see what that is. But this is so clear, it's crystal clear, and it's just amazing that it's in the same area, the same river that Joseph translated the Book of Mormon to see this phrase used this way. So what does head of the river mean? Binghamton, New York, is known as the head of the river Susquehanna. Isn't that amazing? I mean, if you look at this, Binghamton's all the way down here. The headwaters are up here. So why is Binghamton called the head of the river Susquehanna? When I was there earlier this year in September, I went to Binghamton and I kind of went through this area that says prehistoric sites at the confluence. The confluence is why they call it the head of the river. And these are all sites that the students from the archaeology department there have excavated, that ancient Indian sites of people living there. And they had a placard here at the Confluence Park, they call it. And it shows the rivers come together, the history of it and so on. Don't have time to elaborate on that, but I took this picture of the confluence. You can see I'm on a bridge over the river coming from the north. And over on the left there, where there's a little bar kind of, it's a little flood barrier. That's the Susquehanna River coming from Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Joseph translated the Book of Mormon. And these two rivers meet. Now, the one I'm on looks like it's more than one river, but it's just really one river right now because the water's low. So these two rivers meet, and then they go up to the upper right. They continue on down to Philadelphia. Here's what the park looks like, Confluence Park. And right on there, they explain how this was a sacred spot for the Native Americans. And it was a meeting place and a habitation and so on. But it was called the head of the river, even by Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards gave us a real world application. It's not speculation. Don't have to argue about what a dictionary says. This was his real world application of the term head of the river. It's how he told people in England where his son was. Not just any river, but the Susquehanna River. I mean, this is so awesome. And it was 20 miles downstream from Harmony, where Joseph translated the abridged place. So, of course, this isn't determinative or final. The Mesoamerican guys will disagree with all this, but this is just a matter of history that anybody can see for themselves. I didn't make any of this up. It's if you go to Binghamton, it's called the head of the river Susquehanna. There's even Confluence Park. Jonathan Edwards referred to it in his letters. There's more examples that I didn't put in here. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that's in a way, it's exasperating that you can show people this direct historical evidence of the use of that phrase that's in the Book of Mormon and what it really means, but they can still argue with it. And that's because everybody's confirming their biases. Okay, so what does the head of the river mean? Basically, the Meso M2C scholars think it means the headwaters. Those of us who believe in Heartland, North America, New York, Cumorah, believe it means convergence. And when you apply convergence to the geography I showed you earlier in Missouri and Illinois and Tennessee, then the head of the river Sidon fits perfectly with the text. Just awesome. All right, so that's we only talked about one little phrase there, head of the river. We could talk about the narrow neck of land, small neck of land, the East Sea, the West Sea South, all those terms have similar types of explanations for how they fit North America. And we don't have time to go through any more of those right today because I still have to get to the evidence a little bit. But I just wanted to give you this because for me, this is just such an awesome example of how, remember at the beginning, I said you can choose to either debate the words of the prophets and find evidence to contradict them, or you can accept the words of the prophets and find evidence to corroborate them. And I chose to do the latter. I think it's awesome. The more I trust what the prophets taught us about the New York Cumorah and the other things, the more evidence you can find that corroborates it. And this is one of the best.
So John, I
yeah.
have to ask you, so are you suggesting that we look at the glass half full?
I'm not sure what you mean by that, but
well, why not trust the prophets?
Okay.
I'm so glad
well,
you're pointing that out, that there's so many prophetic.
I know.
And yet we still struggle. It's amazing. You know, I got a couple questions that came in. I don't know if you want to really tackle them right now. I've got more than a couple, to be honest.
Well, let me finish this section, and then before I do the next section, I'll do some questions.
Great.
So I'm going to come back to this Museum of the Book of Mormon, because if you go there, we have a section on evidences, teachings, and origins. And the origins talk about the geography, if you're interested in that. And so, and the other thing I was going to just bring up, and not as a sales pitch, but just so you're aware from an informational standpoint, I wrote an entire book on this stuff. I mean, talking about how the scriptures describe North America. And you can buy it through Deseret Book or Amazon or my publisher or whatever. But it's, it's pretty comprehensive. There's a smaller version of it and a thicker version of it if you're interested. I have a web page called just moronizeamerica.com without the apostrophe that you can go to that has maps and resources and information. Some of that's on the MOBOM site as well. We're going to put most of it over on here, but this Museum of the Book of Mormon isn't just me. It's not about just my ideas. I have links to Book of Mormon Central here. I have links to lots of other resources because I think it should be a neutral site that anybody, whether you're a believer or not, whether you believe in Heartland or Mesoamerica, whether you're a Hindu, Muslim, it doesn't matter. This is a museum of the Book of Mormon. And we're trying to put as many references as we can in a comprehensive but understandable way. And we did this partly because we were hoping Book of Mormon Central would do this for us, but instead they've decided to just be advocates for the Mesoamerican stuff. And they've refused to put anything that supports what the prophets have taught about Hill Cumorah on their website. So it's a total failure as far as I'm concerned. And they're spending millions of dollars every year on it. And I've tried for 3 or 4 years at least to get them to accept the church's position of neutrality on these issues. And so far they refuse. So we had to do our own museum here and put things from all different perspectives. So the next one is we've talked about the prophets, we talked about how the scriptures describe North America. The next is on the evidence, but why don't I pause here, Paul, and we could do some of the questions.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you taking them. Some questions that we get, and I've got half a dozen to a dozen here, they're softball questions, and I appreciate them. And while there are others that are hardball questions, almost like stump the speaker kind of stuff.
Okay.
There's one in here that refers to the Isthmus of Darien.
Right.
statement. I know you're familiar, but I don't know if we want to tackle something like that. But you know, it is interesting to me that we have intelligent, well-read people in our audience. So I feel that it's worthy of a moment of your time. And
Well,
the question, by
what
the way,
is the actual question?
can Jonathan address the Isthmus of Darien statement printed in Orson Pratt's publication
Okay, yeah, you're right. That's a great question.
and then
And it's,
reprinted?
yeah, and Joseph Fielding Smith talked about it. That was the basis for the whole hemispheric idea. It was the Pratt brothers and Benjamin Winchester talked about the Isthmus of Darien, which is basically the Panama
And
area.
the insinuation from the question is that Joseph must have been fine with that idea, or even that he was the author of it, and that's the one
Right.
that troubles me.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that at length, actually, if you want. In the Palmyra bookstore, the same Palmyra bookstore I was talking about, they had a translation of the book by Alexander von Humboldt that talked about Central America primarily, because he called it New Spain. And he referred to Panama as a narrow neck of land, or no, just as the narrow neck. He called it the narrow neck. Maybe he said narrow neck of land, I don't remember. But that was the common phrase for Panama in Joseph Smith's day. They called it a narrow neck. And if you look on a map, it's obvious that it's a narrow neck. And so the Pratt brothers and Benjamin Winchester, when they read the Book of Mormon, they said, well, it says a narrow neck, that has to be Panama, which is the Isthmus of Darien. So they talked about that quite a bit. And that's what I mentioned earlier today. When Joseph Smith wrote the Wentworth letter, he adapted a pamphlet that had been written by Orson Pratt called An Account of Several Remarkable Visions, I think it was. And you can read it in the Joseph Smith papers, because when Joseph wrote the Wentworth letter, he basically took that pamphlet by Orson Pratt and rewrote some of it and added the Articles of Faith, which they originated with Oliver Cowdery. But on this section that we talked about earlier, where Joseph said the remnant are the Indians that live in this country, when you go through, and I've done a side-by-side comparison so you can see it, he was following Orson Pratt until he got to that point. And Orson Pratt went on for about 3 or 4 pages talking about Central, South America, all the natives that live there, the indigenous people, the tribes, however you want to call them, elaborating about how they were Book of Mormon people. And Joseph crossed all that stuff out. And that's why he wrote, the remnant are the Indians that live in this country. He was just, that's not just a random phrase that he quoted from Moroni, although he did quote it from Moroni. But when you read it in context, you can see how significant it was that he was expressly rejecting Orson Pratt's ideas when he wrote that Wentworth letter. And so, but then this was in March of 1842 was when he published the Wentworth letter. And then it was republished, I think a year or 2 later in another periodical, but also in the Times and Seasons. So when you understand that context, and then they had in the Times and Seasons, there were some anonymous articles written that said Book of Mormon events took place in Central America. And one of them even said, I showed it here earlier on the map, and we're digressing into a whole different conversation, but I'll just address it as quickly as I can. The article said that Zarahemla was down in Carigua of Guatemala. And when that article was published, Joseph Smith resigned from the Times and Seasons. He didn't want his name on it anymore. He turned it over to John Taylor, but he had nothing to do with those articles, as I've shown in the various books and so on. But people were speculating all over the place. And during the same period, Joseph made an address to the Relief Society, and he talked about how frustrated he was that people weren't just accepting the things he was teaching. And that was one of his ongoing frustrations with the brethren. He didn't come out, and other than in the Wentworth letter, and then the second time it was published, he didn't expressly reject the Straits of Darien, but he did delete them from Orson Pratt's material. So that's how I look at it. The other thing is, as I said early at the very beginning, the New York Cumorah has really nothing to do with the rest of the geography, because even, when Joseph wrote about what was it? It's section 128. Yeah, when he referred to Cumorah as where the Book of Mormon came from. And all the prophets since, Brigham Young, all the way, Marion G. Romney, LeGrand Richards, you know, even in Jesus the Christ, they talk about Cumorah being in New York. That was a given. The rest of the geography, they've always said, we don't know for sure where these other events took place. Even if you look at DNC 125, where it refers to Zarahemla across from Nauvoo, it doesn't expressly say that was the ancient Zarahemla. That's an interpretation that makes sense and it fits the geography, and Wayne's validating it, but it's not, we can't say that the prophets said Zarahemla was across from Nauvoo because it's an inference from the scriptures. And that's why this whole presentation is only about Cumorah. So when I talk to people who still believe in the hemispheric model, that Lehi landed in Chile and the Lamanites lived in South America, the Nephites lived in North America, Cumorah's in New York, I'm fine with that because Cumorah's in New York. I know people who believe in this whole Central American Straits of Darien idea with Cumorah, New York. I'm fine with that too. I'm fine with anything, actually. People can believe whatever they want, but in terms of how I see the evidence and how I interpret the historical evidence, any theory of geography that relies on what the prophets have taught about the New York Cumorah is legitimate as far as I'm concerned. Even Wayne and I don't agree on every single detail because the text itself is ambiguous. You know, here's a real interesting aspect of it. Everybody says the Book of Mormon took place in the Western Hemisphere. And so my answer to that is, well, why? Or my question is, why do you say the Western Hemisphere? And they say, well, because the prophets have always said that. And I point out, well, the same exact prophets who said the Book of Mormon took place in the Western Hemisphere also said it took place in the Cumorah was in New York. So you separate that, right?
Yeah.
Because if Oliver and Joseph didn't tell us it took place in North America, how would we know? No one else had Moroni instruct him about it. Now, apparently, some of Joseph's brothers also went into the hill Cumorah, but they never talked about it publicly. So all we really have is Joseph's and Oliver's testimony about the hill Cumorah, but they were the same ones who told us about this country and this continent.
Excellent. So can we move on to evidences?
Yeah. Okay. Good. Unless there are any other questions. All right. Let's move on because we are running out of time. So remember, I talked about this 1910 book by Charles Shook that claimed no evidence for the Book of Mormon. That's what led to this whole limited geography in Mesoamerica and the two Cumorahs theory. This book really, ironically, his name is Shook because it's like the simulation giving us a clue because he shook things up quite a bit. And he caused a lot of people to lose their faith. He caused these RLDS scholars to say, well, Cumorah can't be in New York because there's no evidence, had to be in Central America. The fascinating thing to me about this, and I've read this whole book. This guy claimed that there is only one civilization in North America, one ancient civilization. He said all the Indians came from the same people. And the Book of Mormon says there were Jaredites and then Nephites, as well as Mulekites, but he focused on, well, okay, all three, I guess. Jaredites anciently, then the Mulekites and the Nephites came about the same time. They joined up together, you know, roughly 100 or 200 BC. So Charles Shook says the archaeology proves that's false because all the mound builders were only one civilization, not two or three. What's fascinating about this is Charles Shook didn't know about the distinct Adena and Hopewell civilizations. And that's because I believe the Hopewell had been kind of discovered in the late 1800s, but hadn't really been identified and named as a distinct civilization. And the Adena were a little after that. And so when he wrote his book, or at least the manuscript of it, he was correct. Everybody believed that there was only one source of the mound builders. The Book of Mormon, by contrast, said there were two sources. There's ancient Adena, ancient Hopewell. And in his lifetime, Joseph actually identified Hopewell sites as Nephite sites and Adena sites as Jaredite sites. And I don't know if it's on Wayne's DVD, but he has it. He and I have talked about this, specific examples of this. And how could he have known? Because everybody else was saying they were all the same people. There was only one ancient civilization, not two. So for me, this is just phenomenal, because this Charles Shook book that started the whole limited geography in Mesoamerica, the whole two Comoras theory, this was the impetus for that book. And what he was saying in there was what people and scientists believed in Joseph Smith's day, but later discoveries proved that it was wrong. And instead, there really were two different distinct civilizations. And those are the ones that Wayne talked about, the Adena, which correspond to the Jaredite, and the Hopewell, which correspond to the Nephite. Here's a couple more fascinating things. So I'm just going to show you. I am about out of time. This is something that's from the Palmyra Museum, some of the artifacts. If you go there, and you can see the dating on these. And I didn't put a lot of this evidence in there because I figured Wayne was going to be covering it. Let me just go back to this. If you go to Western New York, there's a university in Buffalo called University of Buffalo. And they have an archaeology department. And we've talked to the head of the archaeology department. I've met him several times. I've gone to sites with him. And he's shown me, we would go rumbling through the debris there, and he would pick up an arrowhead and give it to me. I have some of the things he gave me. But he said that they have over 1 million artifacts in their university. Many of them aren't even cataloged. But he gave us a list of, as I recall, is around 20 or 30 Hopewell sites in Western New York. Now, if you look on the scientific maps of the Hopewell, they're focused primarily in Ohio, a little bit down in Tennessee, Florida, a little bit as far west as Kansas, but mostly they're in the area that Joseph Smith called the Plains of the Nephites, between Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. That's where the majority of the Hopewell are. But as the archaeology head there in New York told us, they have 20 or 30 Hopewell sites in Western New York. And if you read the Book of Mormon, Mormon talks about how they basically were in retreat all the way from Zarahemla until they got to Cumorah. It was a multi-year retreat over a long period of time. They regained territory, gave it up again, and so on. But the way he describes it follows the archaeology leading from the Ohio area or Illinois area, Zarahemla, through Indiana, Ohio, up through along the Great Lakes into Western New York. The other thing is there's a great book called by Ephraim Squire, who lived in the mid 1800s, who did a survey of archaeology in Western New York. He was the one that also did the survey of archaeology in Ohio. Some of the pictures that Wayne showed were from his book. But he did one of Western New York, and he said that he found lots of hilltop mounds, or not mounds, but fortifications. And he said they were very rudimentary compared to the ones in Ohio, which makes perfect sense. If they were retreating the way that Mormon describes in the Book of Mormon, his own book, he describes how they were in retreat, fleeing before the Lamanites, but they would throw up defenses as best they could and so on until they finally got to the hill Cumorah. So here in this area of around Cumorah, Western New York, it isn't just Hopewell sites. There's also Adena sites. And Wayne and I have visited some of these together. One of them is just phenomenal. It has never been excavated. It's one of the differences between Hopewell and Adena was the Adena tended to build these large conical steep mounds, where the Hopewell built lower, more rounded sites, earthworks. And there's an Adena site not far from Palmyra, about maybe 150 to 100 miles, that has never been excavated, and it looks like there's still burials there. So that's, maybe I shouldn't have talked about that because I haven't told you where it is. But there's also an extensive Hopewell type fortification near one of the Great Lakes. Anyway, the point is that both of these civilizations are very distinct, contrary to what Charles Shook said in his book when he said there's only one civilization. He didn't know about these two distinct ones, but they are very distinct, and they're widely recognized by archaeologists in North America. Now, let's see what it, oh, okay, I just threw this in here because this is the book that I wrote about the Hill Cumorah, where I cover some of this kind of evidence. Just so you know, it's available if you're interested. And I'm going to put this slide up here as a reminder. If you want this presentation, you can email us here, and then we'll send you the link to it. I'll download it as a whole PDF, so you have the whole thing, everything we talked about. Let me just go back here. I have a lot more stuff in here that we don't have time to cover. Let me just say one more thing about these two civilizations. It's really pretty cool. You can go to any archaeology journal that's based on North America, and they'll talk about the two of these. And one in particular that just fascinated me was these guys were out in Ohio, and they were doing an excavation of a site. As Wayne indicated, most of these sites have been plowed over, and so they're very difficult to find unless you use LiDAR and so on. But they found one site, and they were digging into it, and the archaeology report said that they determined from the dating of all the different artifacts that the community was established long before the defensive wall was built around it. And I thought, well, that's exactly what the Book of Mormon says, because normally when you build a city, you build a wall around it first, or you'll be attacked while you're building it, right? But these archaeologists were surprised to see this, that the wall was built after the community existed. And that's what Moroni said. He said they went around fortifying the cities. That's just one tiny example of many about how modern archaeology is reaffirming exactly what the prophets have said all along. Now, Paul, I imagine there's probably a question about all the people dead at Cumorah. Is there any evidence of that? Anybody ask that question?
Say again?
The question about archaeology at the Hill Cumorah itself.
That's like a universal question. Everybody says, why aren't there more bones there in them hills?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I'll tell you my take on it, and that I have about 3 minutes, it looks like. So let me I'll preempt the question because it comes up almost every time. And if you read the Book of Mormon carefully about the Jaredite battle, it took 7 days. He says he covers 7 days. And for the last 3 days, he tells you how many people were killed, or how many survived at least. Last day, it was just the two of them, right? Coriantumr and Shiz. And then before that, it has the numbers. I don't have it on the slide here, but I put that in a spreadsheet and went backwards. And the number was less than 10,000. And you think, well, how could that be? I thought there were millions of people killed at the Hill Cumorah that were in the Jaredite battles. But if you read the Book of Mormon, when Coriantumr talked about 2 million men being killed, that was years before Cumorah ever happened. And he was, in my view, when you read it carefully and see what Ether had told him and so on, he's looking back on his entire history of his people, all 33 generations of people. And when you average that out, 2 million people, or 2 million men and their families, but 2 million men over 33 generations, it's in the 20, 30,000 at most a year. By the time they got to Cumorah, there was less than 10,000 of them left. And when Oliver Cowdery wrote Letter 7, he talked about this. It's amazing. He said there were thousands of Jaredites and tens of thousands of Nephites and Lamanites. He made the distinction. So if there had been over 10,000 Jaredites, he would have said 10,000 or tens of thousands, but he didn't. He said thousands of Jaredites. So he knew that there was less than 10,000. And if you had a battle involving 10,000 people, over 2,000 years ago, you wouldn't find any trace of it. In fact, even the Battle of Hastings in England, which was 10,000 men involved, they still don't know where that took place because they can't find any archaeological evidence of it. Interesting. And they know from the history where it was supposed to take place, but archaeologists are arguing about it because they've never found 10,000 bodies anywhere. And if you look at this valley here, where these battles took place, bones deteriorate pretty fast. Otherwise, it would be littered with deer bones and bones of other animals, right? Mm-hmm. And so now I'm still talking about the Jaredites. I'll get to the Nephites in a sec. Jaredite bones would be long gone. What about the Nephites? When Oliver Cowdery said there were tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands. And that's really significant because if you read in Mormon 6:6, Mormon says he could see the 10,000 of Moroni and the 10,000 of his, those are the only two 10,000s he said he could see, he could visually see. Then he says, and behold, all these other 10,000s had died. They weren't there. They were long before Cumorah, at least before Cumorah, because he couldn't see them. So if you had 20,000 people here, and well, the other thing is, when it says the 10,000 of Moroni, or my 10,000, that word thousand could mean a literal 10,000 numbers, not 9,999, but 10,000, or it could be military, 10 military units. And that's more likely by far. And I have lots of examples from history of where military units were called after a general number, not that they were literally that many in the unit. And one example is when the children of Israel left Egypt. Now I'm digressing too much. Point is, even when it says 10,000, it doesn't necessarily mean 10,000 people. And there are only two groups of 10,000. That fits with what Oliver Cowdery said. So that's the answer to the question. We could elaborate more, but so I don't believe there were hundreds of thousands of people. You know, you'd have to have 400,000 or 500,000 people killed in this valley, which to me doesn't make sense. It's not what the scriptures say, and it contradicts what Oliver said. So that's why there's and arrowheads used to be very prolific here. The kids who lived here used to use them to skip stones because you could skip arrowheads easier than stones because they're flat. And the kids said they used to skip stones. They were so abundant. The farmers plowed up so many, they would put them out for tourists to take. And there's still plenty, like I said, 1 million artifacts in the university. So I probably spoke too much about a hypothetical question, but I only did it because it's such a common question.
Well,
and I talk about all that in that book.
Very common, as a matter of fact. So I'm glad we did address it. There was one last question. If you give 30 to 90 seconds on this one,
Okay.
about whether or not there's been any headway into including Heartland model artwork into the official church manuals. And I've seen one example in a video during conference that, but other than that, I've not seen much. Do you have a pulse on that?
Yeah. Okay. We've talked to the church about that, or I should say, I don't want to say me, but people in the Heartland. And they said, well, we don't have any artwork. Give it to us and we'll use it. And so we're working on that right now. We've had, there's 2 or 3 very well-known church artists who have done cover art for the Ensign that have painted Heartland work now. And some of those paintings are in the annotated Book of Mormon, if you've seen that. There was a video the church put out a few years ago based on Elder Christofferson's talk about the plates in Moroni and how precious a record, I think it was called. And right in there, they have Christ appearing to the mounds in North America. Not to any Mayan civilization. It was based on the mounds along the Mississippi River, which are earth mounds covered with dirt and all that. And that's where Christ appeared to the Nephites in this video. So there have been examples in church materials recognizing the Heartland, because the church is officially neutral on this. And right. the curriculum department has tried to be more neutral, and they have given some examples. Let me just mention that real quick. I emphasized President Nelson's point on this is that the primary purpose of the Book of Mormon is bring people to Christ, not to talk about geography and history. But he admitted those are interesting topics. And for some people, they're very critical topics. And so neutrality is the only position the church could possibly take apart from Cumorah, because the prophets every prophet who talked about Cumorah being in New York was vague about where everything else could be. And I think it's because we showed you that picture of the hundreds of thousands of mounds in North America. How would you say this is a Nephite one and this isn't, right? So it's wise for the church to be neutral on it. That's why I'm neutral on it too. Like I said, as long as you're sticking with Cumorah, New York, I'm open to anybody's ideas.
I appreciate.
Anyway, there you go.
I really appreciate you also mentioning President Nelson's quote. You know, he uses the word incidental, and I'm sure that he's absolutely correct at 30,000 feet. Everything is about, you know, does the information you place your focus on draw you nigh unto Christ? And that's really all that matters. But when I when I think of the many people, especially in our audience, that are, that study the scriptures,
Mhm.
it's not incidental.
Sure.
The geography, perhaps, but again, and I'm glad we went to the evidence in the scriptural, and I'm sure Bruce is going to even point out why understanding the everlasting decree, to quote
Mhm.
Bruce's book,
Yep.
and the title of liberty, there is some very significant reasons we need to understand where the Book of Mormon lands are. Would you not agree?
I totally agree. Let me give you an anecdote along those lines. I went out with the missionaries. This was their second visit to this guy. And they said, Brother Neville, we need you to come to meet him. I said, okay. So I went. And he pulled out a sheaf of paper that he printed off for the missionaries that he'd gotten from the internet, mostly from Fair Mormon type sources, Book Mormon Central type stuff. And he said, I read the first 50 pages or so of this book, but I'm not going to read another word until you can tell me this is a real history, because your own people have no idea where it took place. And I said, hey, dude, I can work with you on this. When we left, the missionaries said they can't go back to him. And I said, what do you mean? He's still interested. And they said, well, our mission president told us people like that we shouldn't go back to because he's not ready. So I called a friend who works. I called a friend of mine who works for the missionary department, and I said, "All right, I just was with the elders and told not to go back to somebody if they have questions." And he said, "Yeah, we were losing so many missionaries because investigators were asking questions they'd never thought about. That we tell them if they're asking questions that are challenging, that they're not ready, so don't go back to them." That's what they told me.
Oh,
And isn't
please
that
tell me
amazing?
that's not an official stance of the missionary department, but it sounds like.
Well, that's what he told me their policy was. And that's
Wow.
what the missionaries told me they were instructed. So in the ensuing time with this guy, I followed up with him, and we became pretty good friends. He came to our church when I was speaking, I went to his church when he was speaking, and we had dinner and stuff. And he ended up moving away, but before he left, he told me, I have to tell you something. You've convinced me that Camaro's in New York.
Bravo.
And
Bravissimo.
so he has the Book of Mormon. He's all interested in it. He says, we probably can't sort it out till the next life, but you've completely changed my mind about this Mormon thing.
So one last comment from one of our participants, and that is when you get an opportunity to speak to those artists that have done some Heartland renditions, the suggestion is perhaps Moroni ought to lose his Roman helmet.
For sure. For sure. I know that I think it's referring to one particular piece that we didn't have any control over the artist. And
Indeed.
so, but we have shown them, we've given them now. In fact, I have an illustrated book coming out. You're going to see in about a month. And we give the artist Hopewell artifacts from the museums in Ohio and New York and stuff.
Yeah.
So they can see what the breastplate actually looks like. It's called a head plate in the Book of Mormon, not a helmet, but it's what an actual head plate looks like, what the armbands look like, all the stuff that's described in the Book of Mormon, you can see in the museums in the Midwestern United States. And that's what we're giving them to use, not the
Perfect.
Roman.
Perfect.
But
All right,
good question.
Jonathan, I'm going to switch you off and I'm going to just quickly go to my PowerPoint and just plug you one more time.
Okay.
See if I can pull it up. I mentioned to everyone that you've got some really, really strong materials. I think you have 40 plus books. And the one that you showed the most, of course, was this one that you find on Amazon. And you actually have encouraged people to go ahead and purchase at Amazon, which shows a little surprise, but so be it. And for those that
But
are...
you want me to tell you why?
Yeah, please.
Okay, because for Amazon, the number one thing is the reviews. And if you can do a review on Amazon, but if you're not a buyer, then they don't really rank it. And so, I mean, I'd like to reduce the price. Maybe I could, but I have to see when Deseret Book carries a book, they they require that the same price be on Amazon, basically. So I'm stuck with that. But I encourage you to buy the Kindle if you like.
Well, that's very good to know, though, that it is the reviews. I live in a world where Google ratings, reviews, and web reviews are relevant, to say the very least. So thanks for sharing that. I hope and trust
That's why.
everyone,
Yeah.
that purchases over in that environment will pay you that courtesy of reviewing.
Right.
The last thing I wanted to point out is that your Moroni's America is perhaps the best one to focus in on the Heartland model. Is that correct?
Yeah, because it was my wife's fault that I wrote this book, because she said, all right, you're talking about Heartland. I want to know how the scriptures fit. So she gave me a list of 300 passages in the Book of Mormon that talk about geography. And I looked at it and I said, seriously? And she said, yeah, seriously.
Wow.
So I ended up writing this book, and it was amazing to me. I learned so much doing it, how well the Book of Mormon describes North America. It was astonishing. So that's what
We
that one is.
appreciate our wives.
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and give us a 2-minute break. I'm going to call up Bruce here in just a moment, and certainly am exceedingly grateful for the contribution, Jonathan. Maybe you'll be with us at the end, maybe not. I know you're traveling and you're with family, so if we don't catch you at the end, so be it. But I am going to take Jonathan off host and now move over to Bruce.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. And let's bring Bruce on board as a co-host. And hopefully, now that he is brought on, I can stop sharing and allow Bruce to talk specifically about the scriptures and what they contribute in our understanding of the Heartland model. Bruce, I see you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I am too, but I do see you. I see you're in your man cave.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for joining us today. We've had a wonderful day so far, and I'm sure we're all anticipating some information from you. I was going to give a 2-minute break, but I don't want to cut into your time. So, we cut into it just a tad because we allowed the Q&A along the way, except rather than at the end. Would you prefer that we hold off on questions until the end and I just gather up a few and pick a couple for you?
It'd probably be better that way.
Excellent. I know in person you're the opposite. You love to play stump the speaker.
Well, I'll just speed. I'll get through it as quick as I can, and then they can ask
All
a few
right. Well,
questions.
don't hurry yourself. If we go a little over 5 o'clock, I don't think the Zoom platform will cut us off. If it does, lesson learned. But go ahead and we'll hold off on the questions. Thank you.
Oh, you want me to start now?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, let me get it on. I've got to share a screen, don't I?
Yes, you do. I believe I've given you that control. I'm 90% sure you're ready to go.
You have somebody that raised their hands, I see there.
Yeah, I see a couple hi Bruces and exclamation marks as well.
Okay.
Very popular.
All right, I will get started then, hopefully. Am I sharing screen now?
Well, I do see there. Yeah, I got you on my end. You just got to go to play now. I think you're in, and there you go. You are full screen, my friend.
Okay, let me move this around. Okay, well, I'm gonna spend most of my time on scripture, and the key. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
The idea is to let the scriptures speak for themselves. That's the main thing. And so the official position, as we've talked about already, the official position of the church on the geographical setting of the Book of Mormon is that there is no official position. So you have to understand that. I think the official position, if you were to ask anybody, is that they will stand with Joseph Smith. Well, Mormon and Moroni, with a view of a fallen culture and a people right by inspiration and commandment, it says, by inspiration and commandment, a record for future generations. Now, as I start this, I want you to know that I will give Paul a PDF of all these slides if you want, and he can send them out for anybody who requests them, but I'll give it for that. So there's going to be a little bit of review before I jump right into the scriptures, but just for basic information. But Mormon and Moroni are writing for a future generation because there's nobody left there to read it by the time the end comes. So when the text is compiled, we know that there's nobody left to read that. And so it's really put together for other people. When we read the Book of Mormon, we ought to be asking ourselves the question at the end of every story, or at the end of every statement, at the end of every chapter, why did Mormon, or why did the authors feel that this was important for us to know in the last days? We have to ask ourselves that question. Why do I need to know that? We have to liken it unto ourselves. Ask why Nephi, Mormon, Moroni chose the historical and non-gospel insights for the Latter-day Saints. Why do we need to read it? And we know that we're the ones that read the Book of Mormon. It's not on the New York Times bestseller list, neither is it a must-read on Oprah. The people who really read the Book of Mormon and seek to understand the Book of Mormon are Latter-day Saints, and those who are seeking to become, or converts, or investigators to become Latter-day Saints. President Benson said, the Book of Mormon was written for us today. God is the author of the book. It's a record of a fallen people compiled by inspired men for our blessing today. Those people never had the book. It was meant for us. Mormon, the ancient prophet after whom the book is named, abridged centuries of records. God, who knows the end from the beginning, told him what to include in his abridgment so that abridgment that we would need for our day. It's for us and for our understanding. In the Doctrine and Covenants in section 84, we read, which vanity and unbelief have brought the whole church under condemnation. And this condemnation rests upon the children of Zion, even all, and they shall remain under this condemnation until they repent and remember the new covenant, even the Book of Mormon. So we're told that one thing that we need to be doing is remembering the Book of Mormon and the former commandments which I was given them. And we sometimes forget to read the rest of the verse, and it goes on, not only to say, not just to have our favorite passage or our favorite scripture to quote, but to do according to that which is written. We need to understand it in such a way to do what's written in the book, to realize that it's written for us. In the Doctrine and Covenants, it gives us two of the intrinsic messages of the Book of Mormon. It contains a record of a fallen people and a fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles and to the Jews also. And that includes just about everybody except Paul Schween, Gentiles and Jews. But it's for us. It's a record of a fallen people for a purpose, and it contains a fullness of the gospel for a purpose to everybody, for the whole world. Many say it really doesn't matter where the Book of Mormon took place. And to a certain extent and for a certain reason it doesn't, but there is a purpose in knowing and understanding the place where it takes place. Where is that promised land and choice land? As Jonathan has talked about, everybody has a different opinion, and opinions are okay. You can have that opinion and you can't slight anybody for having a different opinion as to where that might matter. But if it doesn't matter where the promised land is, then there's a lot of scriptures that don't really matter, like this one. And now we can behold at the decrees of God concerning this land, that it is a land of promise, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall serve God, or they shall be swept off when the fullness of his wrath shall come upon them. For behold, this is a land which is choice above all other lands, and wherefore he that doth possess it shall serve God, or shall be swept off, for it is the everlasting decree of God. Now, that would imply, just those few verses there would imply that it's important to know where that land is in order to be protected, in order for that protection and prosperity that's required. That's one reason that we need to know where it's at. This verse wouldn't matter if it doesn't matter. Wherefore this land is consecrated unto him whom he shall bring. And if so be they shall serve him according to the commandments which he hath given, it shall be a land of liberty to them. Wherefore they shall never be brought down into captivity. If so, it shall be because of iniquity. For if iniquity shall abound, cursed shall be the land for their sakes. But unto the righteous it shall be blessed forever. So what it's telling us is if we know where it is and know what these restrictions are, then we can ensure our freedom and our protection and our prosperity. This verse wouldn't matter if it doesn't matter. But behold, this land, saith God, shall be a land of their inheritance, and the Gentiles shall be blessed upon the land. And this land shall be a land of liberty unto the Gentiles. And there shall be no kings upon the land, who shall raise up unto the Gentiles. And I will fortify this land against all other nations. And he that fighteth against Zion shall perish, saith God. And again, another one in Ether. And this is Moroni speaking here, as he's giving some commentary on the Jaredite record. And he has sworn in his wrath unto the brother of Jared that whoso should possess this land of promise from that time henceforth and forever, and that's from the time of the brother of Jared, from that time henceforth and forever, should serve him, the true and only God, or they should be swept off when the fullness of his wrath shall come upon them. So it's these restrictions, this covenant is connected to the land, not necessarily the people. And from that time, from henceforth and forever, is quite a long time. In Ether, Moroni goes on, and this cometh unto you, O ye Gentiles, that you may know the decrees of God, that you may repent and not continue in your iniquities. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ, the fullness of the gospel. Until the fullness come, that you may not bring down the fullness of the wrath of God upon you, as the inhabitants of the land have hitherto done. That's the record of a fallen people. And he goes on and declares, behold, this is a choice land, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage and from captivity and from all nations under heaven, if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ. That's the deed restrictions, who hath been manifested by the things which we have written. These are the three intrinsic messages of the Book of Mormon. It contains the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ, contains a record of a fallen people, and the deed restrictions, or CC&Rs, however you want to describe that, to the promised land. Well, the gospel of Jesus Christ is for whom? It's for the whole world, for everyone. As the Book of Mormon begins, it talks about that it's written by way of commandment to Jew and Gentile for the convincing that Jesus is the Christ. So the gospel of Jesus Christ, this first and probably most important intrinsic message of the Book of Mormon, is a second witness of Jesus Christ, and that's for the whole world. A record of the fallen people, you have to ask yourself, why do we, because Latter-day Saints are the only ones who read it, why do we need a record of a fallen people? Why do we need to understand what happened before with those who knew and understood the gospel? And if that part is written for that intrinsic message, is written for members of the church. And then the restrictions on the promised land, on that land itself, are for those who live on that promised land. Because if we do not worship the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ, which is an everlasting decree, henceforth and forever, then they will be swept off in the Lord's due time. First Nephi we read, and it came to pass that I beheld the Spirit of God, that it wrought upon other Gentiles, and they went forth out of captivity upon the many waters. And I beheld that their mother Gentiles were gathered together upon the waters and upon the land also to battle against them. Well, who are these Gentiles? And we know who the Gentiles are. We always immediately say, well, that's the pilgrims, the Puritans that come on the Mayflower to this land. Last year, 2020 was a very interesting year so far as anniversaries go. It was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation that begins with Martin Luther. It's the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims coming to the Promised Land, or to the Americas, and it was the 200th anniversary of the First Vision. All of them connected, intimately connected. From the Reformation really begins the Restoration, and those coming to a new land for religious freedom. And then all of a sudden, just 200 years later, then there is a new nation based upon religious freedom. Again, Nephi continues, and it came to pass, I beheld many multitudes of the Gentiles upon the land of promise. And I beheld the Spirit of the Lord, that it was upon the Gentiles, and they did prosper and obtain the land for their inheritance. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, beheld that the Gentiles who had gone forth out of captivity did humble themselves before the Lord, and the power of the Lord was with them. Now, as we talked about those with the two Cumorah theory or the Mesoamerican theory, you have to begin asking yourself if these verses pertain to Central America or Guatemala or the Yucatan Peninsula. When you start looking at it and understanding, when you have the right focus to begin with, the right foundation, then the understanding comes much easier. And this is what Nephi is trying. You see in the prophets in the Book of Mormon, you see that these prophets and Nephi are trying to make sure that we in the last days can't misunderstand where that promised land is at. And he's talking about these prophecies and promises. The Gentiles are going to be on the land of promise. The Spirit of the Lord was going to be upon there so they could prosper and obtain the land for their inheritance. And he's talking about those Gentiles who had gone out of captivity. These are the ones that he's prospering and protecting, that they'd gone forth out of captivity. So we have to understand, you have to begin looking at yourself and asking, why do we need to know this? And why is this important? And the same passage continues, and I beheld that the power of God was with them, the Gentiles, and also that the wrath of God was upon all those that were gathered together against them to battle. I, Nephi, beheld that the Gentiles that had gone out of captivity, those Puritans and Pilgrims and their descendants, were delivered by the power of God out of the hands of all other nations. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, beheld that they did prosper in the land. And I beheld a book, and it was carried forth among them. This is what brought them. That book, the Bible, and being able to read the scriptures in their own language is what really brought them to this promised land in the 1600s. Lehi says, when Lehi lands, or after they land, Lehi, and Nephi's quoting from the book, or from the book of the Testament of Lehi. But Lehi says, and Nephi quotes it there in 2nd Nephi, he says, but notwithstanding our afflictions, we have obtained a land of promise, a land which is choice above all other lands, a land which the Lord hath covenanted with me should be a land for the inheritance of my seed. Yea, the Lord hath covenanted this land unto me and my children forever, and all those who should be led out of other countries by the hand of the Lord. Now, Nephi is quoting Lehi here when he's writing this record, when he abridges Lehi's record. But then Nephi, he sees the same vision that his father sees and receives an understanding. Then Nephi records the information given directly to him. And Nephi writes about what he understands. Nevertheless, thou behold that the Gentiles who have gone forth out of captivity and have been lifted up by the power of God above all other nations upon the face of the land, which is choice above all other lands, which is the land which the Lord God hath covenanted with thy father, that his seed should have for the land of their inheritance. Wherefore thou seest that the Lord God will not suffer that the Gentiles will utterly destroy a mixture of thy seed, which are among thy brethren. Now we have two different passages here, one from 1st Nephi and one from 2nd Nephi. And the interesting thing is they begin to explain each other to make sure that we cannot misunderstand. Now Lehi says, and this is Lehi on the left, he says, notwithstanding our afflictions, we have obtained a land of promise and a land which is choice above all other land. Now, when you look at Nephi's statement, we can start seeing the very same things. In verse 5, we see the same thing in verse 30 that Nephi says in 1st Nephi. It's a land choice above all other lands. It's a land of the covenant, that it's to be a land that was covenanted with Lehi to be a land for the inheritance of his seed. And we see also that those who are going to be led out of other countries are to that land. Nephi tells us that they are the Gentiles who have come forth out of captivity. Now, everybody knows and understands, or basically accepts, that those Gentiles who come out of captivity are the Puritans and Pilgrims that come to that promised land, or their promised land, which is going to be a land that's going to be free for the practice of their faith and religion. So Nephi and Lehi, with this combination, are making sure that we cannot mistake where that land is, because it's the same land that the Gentiles have come to who came out of captivity. Lehi speaks of the promise connected to the land and the relationship of faith to freedom, i.e. those Gentiles who came out of captivity. And this is what Lehi says. Wherefore this land is consecrated unto him whom he shall bring. And if it so be that they shall serve him according to the commandments which he has given them, it shall be a land of liberty. Here is the first time that the restrictions, the deed restrictions, show up. And it's when Lehi lands with his family on the promised land. And it's going to be a land of liberty. And they shall never be brought down into captivity. And if so, it'll be because of iniquity. For if iniquity will abound, cursed will be the land for their sakes. Well, we learned Royal Skousen wrote a lot about the Book of Mormon, and he says the occurrence about it being a Hebrew text, basically from a culture that had Middle Eastern origins. He says the occurrence of non-English Hebraism strongly suggests that the text was tightly controlled down to the level of the word at least. And the spelling of names such as Coriantumr suggests that the control could be imposed down to the very letter. The evidence suggests that Joseph Smith was not the author of the Book of Mormon, not even its English translation, although it was revealed spiritually through him and in his own language and understanding. Now, if that's the case, then there's some interesting things that we have to look at in the text. Hebrew, like English, uses the demonstratives to directly point at and indicate something to answer the question of which. The answer of which will always fall into two main classifications. One being the number, meaning singular or plural, and the other one in proximity, near or remote. I'm not trying to give you an English lesson, but the text is real, and we see it all through the text from beginning to end. Well, the demonstratives are, in the singular, near is this, and the plural are these. That makes it near. This chair, and it's always definite. So it might be this chair that I'm sitting in, or these chairs near me, these chairs sitting in the same room. Or remote, the singular is that one over there, and the plural are those over there. So the demonstratives, and you have to look at these demonstratives when you start reading the scriptures about the promised land. This is singular among the plural, definite within the group, and specific among many, and always in the proximity of the speaker, and must be intimate in the knowledge of the speaker and the listener. Because if both of them don't know and understand it, then it can't be definite, and it can't be specific. That is singular, definite, specific, and remote in difference or distance in respect of the speaker and listener, but they have to know, they have to understand. We see this in the Book of Mormon when Mormon starts talking about the book of the Bible that comes forth, or that they're going to bring, those Gentiles are going to bring with them. And he says, not only in this record, that's near and intimate, this record, which means the Book of Mormon, but also in the record which shall come unto the Gentiles from the Jews, that's the Bible, which record shall come forth from the Gentiles unto you. And then using these demonstratives, he says, for behold, this is written for the intent that you might believe that. And if you believe that, then you will believe this also. And if you believe this, you will know concerning your fathers. So he's using these demonstratives in such a way so that we can understand. For behold, this, the Book of Mormon, is written for the intent that you might believe that, the Bible. And if you believe the Bible, that, you will believe in this, the Book of Mormon also. And if you believe in this, the Book of Mormon, then you will understand concerning your fathers. So looking at the demonstratives within the text itself, being an inspired text, and as Royal Skousen says, given to Joseph Smith by God, then you can begin to understand this. Nephi learns of a land of promise before he arrives. And he says, and inasmuch as ye shall keep my commandments, ye shall prosper there and shall be led to a land of promise. Yea, even a land which I have prepared for you, yea, a land which is choice above all other lands. It's not definite and it's not specific. He doesn't know, he's not been there, it's not there. But then we standing on the land of promise, it becomes the object of Jacob's discussion and the definition of the demonstracy, which is imperative in the understanding. So, but behold, this land, saith God, shall be a land of thine inheritance, and the Gentiles shall be blessed upon the land. Now, this land means it's close, it's intimate, it's definite, and it's where he's at, it's near him. So behold, this land, which you're standing on, shall be a land of thine inheritance, and the Gentiles shall be blessed upon the land. And this land shall be a land of liberty to the Gentiles, and there shall be no kings upon the land who shall raise up unto the Gentiles, and I will fortify this land against all other nations. So using the demonstrative this, or saying the phrase this land, means the land where Jacob is standing, the land that he is familiar with, that is intimate in his knowledge, and that it's definite. It's not some other land. It's not hemispherical, and it may not even be continental. It's this land. It's where he's at. So we have to let the text speak for itself. In 2 Nephi, we read, and behold, it is wisdom that this land, again, intimate, definite, and specific, should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations. For behold, many nations would overrun the land, and there would be no place for an inheritance. So he's telling us that the land that Lehi landed on, that Lehi and his family are on, that land itself, this land, will be kept from the knowledge of other nations so that they can have an inheritance. In 2 Nephi, again in 1, we read, and wherefore I, Lehi, have obtained a land of promise, inasmuch as those whom the Lord shall bring out of the land of Jerusalem, that they shall be kept from all other nations, that they may possess this land unto themselves. And if it so be that they shall keep his commandments, they shall be blessed upon the face of this land, and there shall be none to molest them, nor take away the land of their inheritance, and they shall dwell safely forever. Again, it's using the demonstrative. It must be remembered that the Book of Mormon is a history of 3 migrations to the Promised Land. We have the Jaredites, the Mulekites, and the Lehites. But the book is also a prophetic history of a fourth migration. We see that right from the very beginning of the book. This fourth migration, and that's the Gentiles who come to the same land of promise with the same restrictions. And so you have to begin connecting the Gentiles and the prophecies about the Gentiles to that promised land in order to begin to determine where that land might be. Jacob, the brother of Nephi, also speaks of the promises connected to the land and the relationship of these promises to the Gentile. And he says, wherefore the promises of the Lord are great unto the Gentiles. And again, it's speaking of those that come out of captivity and the descendants of those who come out of that captivity, i.e. the Puritans and Pilgrims. For he has spoken it, and who can dispute? For behold, this land, saith God, shall be a land of thine inheritance, and the Gentiles shall be blessed upon the land, and this land shall be a land of liberty unto the Gentiles. And again, there will be no kings upon the land who shall rise up unto the Gentiles, and I will fortify this land against all other nations. Wherefore the Gentiles will be blessed and numbered among the house of Israel. Wherefore I'll consecrate this land unto thy seed, and to them, i.e. the Gentiles, who shall be numbered among thy seed, forever for the land of their inheritance, for it is a choice land, saith God unto me above all other lands. Wherefore I will, because of that, I will have all men that dwell thereon, that they shall worship me, saith the Lord. Now, you have to begin asking yourself, why is this land so important? Well, it's, you might say it's the land eastward of Eden, where Adam begins his life in a temporal world. It's the land where the great patriarchs of Seth, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch lived. It's the land where the city of Enoch was built. It's the land where the city of Enoch was translated from. It's the land that the city of Enoch will return to. So he says it's a choice land unto God, unto me above all other lands. And that's one reason that all men that dwell thereon will worship God. And that's why this land is set up to be a free land. And the Gentiles, it's talking about those Gentiles that come out of captivity. And it meaneth that the time cometh that after all the house of Israel had been scattered and confounded, that the Lord God will raise up a mighty nation among the Gentiles. And as Wayne said in his video, as soon as you put country or nation, you're putting borders and boundaries on it. And God will raise up a mighty nation among the Gentiles, even upon the face of this land. And by them shall our seed be scattered. And we see that with the manifest destiny as we moved westward in the few centuries ago. Well, the inspired authors of the Book of Mormon did not expect the readers of the Book of Mormon to link the geographical passages of Scripture with physical ruins. And they have found that there are over 150 different maps for locations of a Book of Mormon setting based on the geographical passages. And the authors did not expect the readers of the Book of Mormon to link those geographical passages of scriptures with physical ruins in order to determine where the promised land is located. And they have failed, those authors have failed if the promised land cannot be identified without question from the prophetic statements from the text itself. It has to be within the text, ignoring any and all archaeological evidence, ruins, and opinions that is out there. The prophecies and promises and the deed restrictions about the promised land are of no value and only wasted space on the plates and wasted prophetic time if it doesn't matter in our minds where the Book of Mormon took place, or we're looking in the wrong place. All of that information about the deed restrictions and that information about freedom, about having no kings, about a land of liberty, about being protected doesn't matter at all if we don't care where it took place. If the promised land cannot be identified from the text itself, then guesswork is our only option. And that seems what happened, whether one agrees or whether one disagrees. The Book of Mormon was written with enough prophetic information within the text to identify without question, debate, or dispute where that land and Gentile nation is located that became a home to those Gentiles that came out of captivity. For almost everyone, when reading the Book of Mormon the first time, there was almost no question as to where the promised land was located. However, over time, one may be taught to trust in opinions, interpretations, and traditions, as Jonathan has well explained. We have to sometimes just let this text speak for ourselves. The best commentary on the scriptures is always the scripture themselves. Well, there's multiple prophecies and promises about the land within the scriptures. These prophecies and promises about that land and the connected restrictions were a major concern and worry for the prophets of the Book of Mormon. This message was a warning prepared for the hearts and minds of those who would read and hopefully understand the Book of Mormon. If it wasn't mattered, the Book of Mormon was written by inspiration and by commandment, it tells us. And these restrictions were placed in there first by inspiration and by commandment. And those restrictions are connected directly to the land itself. The Book of Mormon explains how to maintain the freedom that is promised to the land that is choice above all other lands and the Gentile nation upon that land. The promises of security, prosperity, and freedom are connected to the chosen land by divine decree and secured, we are told in the text itself, by worship and faith in Jesus Christ. As we read in Ether, whatsoever nation shall possess it shall serve God, or they shall be swept off when the fullness of his wrath shall come. And we have witnesses of different cultures, even within the Book of Mormon, to tell us that this is true. The responsibility to recognize Jesus Christ as the God of the promised land cannot be limited to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The knowledge that there is a connection of faith to freedom places a responsibility upon those who have the deed restrictions, those who read and understand the Book of Mormon. Political freedoms held sacred cannot be separated from that faith and religion. As it says, as Moroni explains again on we rehearse his statements. It is a choice land, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage and from captivity and from all other nations under heaven, if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ. See, that whole verse there means nothing if it doesn't matter where that promised land is. If it doesn't matter. Well, modern scholarship in the Book of Mormon geography. And when I say modern scholarship, I'm talking about many of those at BYU who embrace the Tucumora theory or the Central America. And I want you to see what they have to say. The official position of the church is there's no official position. You have to keep in that mind. John Sorens, who wrote in Mormon's Map, and he's kind of the father of the message of the Tucumora theory today. I mean, it began before him, but he's really that brought it to the fore. Writes, what logically would seem to be one of the first steps in a systematic investigation would be to construct a map of the America land of promise based solely on scripture, on statements in that scripture. And then he says there's at least 550 passages are relevant. And this, he says, seems not to have occurred to anyone during the church's first century. So he says, the only way to construct a map is look at these passages. And the passages he's talking about are geography. He says, he continues, I believe by doing our level best to approach the words of the Book of Mormon having to do with geography without preconceptions. So he's saying the only way to know where that land is is to first and foremost look at the geographical passages, not the prophetic passages, but the geographical passages. And these geographical passages have become the trusted GPS of a Book of Mormon setting, right or wrong. That's what is being used, is the geographical passages. And he goes on, he says, the first step in this method is to extract from the Book of Mormon those passages involving geographical references and create or develop an internal or hypothetical map. This is what they use. This is the basis of determining or coming to the conclusion that the Book of Mormon setting is in the Yucatan Peninsula. As of the year 2000, there were over 80 different versions of such maps that have been produced, and in recent estimations have raised that number to over 150 different locations from using the exact same geographical passages. Now, if you put the right address, city, state in your GPS and gave you 150 different locations, the first thing you're going to do is get rid of the GPS. And this is kind of back to what Jonathan said at the end as he went with the missionaries, to the man who says, you don't even know where this is at. You don't even know where this location is. And if you're coming up with 500 different or 150 different locations using the exact same geographical passages, then you have to say something's wrong with the system that you're using. It's an incomplete system. If the Book of Mormon had sufficient geographic information to positively produce a cohesive internal map, why would there exist so many different geographies? Well, again, where is that promise and choice land? Again, you have to look at the text. Elder Cannon said regarding the Book of Mormon geography, he said, the brethren who lecture on the lands of the Nephites or the geography of the Book of Mormon are not united in their conclusions. No two of them, so far as we have learned, are agreed on all points, and in many cases, the variations amount to tens of thousands of miles. How is it that there is such a variety of ideas on this subject? He continues, simply because the Book of Mormon is not a geographical primer. It was not written to teach geographical truths, simply an incidental remark connected with the doctrinal or historical portion of the work, and almost invariably only extends to a statement of the relative position of some land or city to contiguous surrounding places, and nowhere gives the exact situation or boundaries so that it can be definitely located without fear of error. Now, as Brother Sorensen said, the only way to determine where is by the geographical passages. Elder Cannon is saying that the geographical passages are not meant to tell us where the setting was for the Book of Mormon. Well, the research hierarchy I was given years ago was I was told that I could use the scriptures, I could use the statements of Joseph Smith, and I could use a prophet while he was prophet, while he is the prophet, not before. President Smith said, it makes no difference what is written or what anyone has said. If what has been said is in conflict with what the Lord has revealed, we can set it aside. My words and the teachings of any other member of the church, high or low, if they do not square with the revelations, we need not accept them. Let us have this matter clear. President Lee went on to say almost the same thing. He says, if there is any teacher who teaches a doctrine that can't be substantiated from the standard church works, and I make one qualification, and that is unless that one be the president of the church, who alone has the right to declare new doctrine, then you may know by that same token that such a teacher is but expressing his own opinion. Well, again, let's look at modern scholarship and Joseph Smith and what they say about Joseph Smith. Again, Brother Soren says the historical sources gives no indication that Moroni's instructions to young Joseph Smith included geography, nor did Joseph Smith ever claim inspiration on the matter. Ideas he later expressed about the location of events reported in the book apparently reflected his own best thinking. Other quotes, since Moroni offered Joseph Smith only a brief sketch, it's unlikely that he revealed to Joseph comprehensive knowledge of Native American origins. It's important to understand that Joseph Smith did not have access to this knowledge. He translated the book, but apparently did not know the scope of its geography. This is what modern scholarship is saying about Joseph Smith. These are two more. Exactly what Joseph Smith believed at different times in his life concerning the Book of Mormon geography in general. Evidently, Joseph Smith's views on the matter were open to further knowledge. This is the basis, and it's what that says. Two basic statements, two basic ideas, concepts that come from these LDS authors and scholars who support this Tucumorra theory, who seek to support Mesoamerica about the prophet Joseph Smith and his knowledge, fall into two categories. One, that he did not have any knowledge of a setting, and two, he never claimed inspiration on the matter. And to me, that's almost ridiculous. Well, let's look at what Joseph Smith says quickly. And we've gone over this, so I'll just try and go through these very quick. In Joseph Smith history, which is part of the Wentworth letter, he said there was a book deposited written upon gold plates giving account of the former inhabitants of this continent and the source from which they sprang. He also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it, the Book of Mormon, as delivered by the Savior to the ancient inhabitants. Going on from his mother, that was, we already quoted from the history of Joseph Smith. From this time forth, Joseph continued to receive instructions from the Lord. Now, this is between the first vision and him acquiring the plates. We continued to get the children together every evening for the purpose of listening while he gave us a relation of the same. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, their mode of traveling, the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, in every particular with a mode of warfare, and their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. And this he would do with as much ease, seemingly as if he had spent his whole life with them. Again, in the Wentworth letter, I was informed concerning the aboriginal inhabitants of this country and shown. Now he's using demonstratives too. This country, that means where he's at, who they were, from whence they came, a brief sketch, their origin, progress, civilization, laws, governments, their righteousness and iniquity, their blessings, and God finally being withdrawn from them as a people was made known unto me. I was also told where they're deposited on the plates, which were engraven abridgment of the records of the ancient prophets that existed on this continent. So Joseph Smith is claiming that all he knows about them is coming by revelation, that he did know about them. The remnant, he continues, the remnant are the Indians that now inhabit this country, the area where he's at. This book also tells us that our Savior made his appearance upon this continent after his resurrection, not this hemisphere, but this continent. The Book of Mormon, in the history of the church, we read about the American revivalist account. The Book of Mormon is a record of the forefathers of our Western tribes of Indians. By it, the Book of Mormon, we learn our Western tribes of Indians are descendants from that Joseph that was sold into Egypt, and that the land of America is a promised land unto them. When that wasn't published, or when only a portion of Joseph's statement was published in the American Revivalist, he writes back to the editor and says, "Dear sir, I was somewhat disappointed on receiving my paper with only part of my letter inserted in it. The letter which I wrote you for publication, I wrote by the commandment of God." It's interesting that every time Joseph Smith spoke of geography, almost every single time he spoke of geography, he spoke of being inspired or commanded by God about it, to talk about it. The two basic statements, again, that come from many LDS scholars and authors who seek to support the Mesoamerican idea about the prophet Joseph Smith is one, that he did not have any knowledge of the setting, and he never claimed inspiration on the matter. Zion's camp, as we've talked about, as Wayne's talked about, as well as Jonathan, Zion's camp went almost 1,000 miles from the Kirtland area all the way to Adamondiam and Liberty area. It's while he's on this, in this area, he writes to his wife, he says, "The whole of our journey in the midst of so large a company of social, honest, and sincere men, wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and bones as proof of its divine authenticity." And he's on the banks of the Mississippi River when he writes this letter. You can see this is the letter, an older map of the Hopewell and the Adena cultures. And this is the red line is that of the Zion's Camp March. And this is where Joseph Smith says, "We are wandering over the plains of the Nephites, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people." This is the Adena culture, which dates back to the same time period as the Jaredites. And this is the Hopewell, which is almost exactly to the same time period that we have in our Book of Mormon. Well, and this is the Hopewell sphere of influence that we see in by Silverberg, that runs from the Gulf into Canada and from the East Coast into the Plain States. Jonathan has showed this map, as did Wayne, of the different sites, cultural sites that they've seen. But this is there's much more than this. Is maybe only 10%. But I wanted to match it up with this map from Seaman about the interaction sphere and look at it. And I think Wayne would probably agree with this. Most would, but there's 4 key areas that we see so far as the Hopewell area. The earliest Hopewell site is in the Panhandle of Florida, about 500 BC. We might say, well, Lehi didn't. He gets there in this, around 600 BC. But it takes a while to leave enough sources, enough information to identify a place as a culture. And the oldest site is that in the Panhandle of Florida. Many would assume that this might be the land of the first inheritance. After Lehi dies, then Nephi has to leave and go to another land, which Jonathan already brought up in Tennessee area, which might be the land of Nephi. From there, after leaving there, they go to the land of Zarahemla with the Mulekites, and if any place could be called bountiful, it would probably be that area as you get closer to the Kirtland area. So these are all just connections and assumptions. One isn't that has been brought up already is Zelf Mound and what happened at Zelf Mound. Again, this is dealing with geography and dealing with revelation. Joseph takes, I think it's about 8 or 12 men to this mound after they cross the Illinois River. He sends a few of them back to get a shovel. He digs down about between 1.5 feet and 2 feet, exposes a skeleton and finds an arrow point that had gone through the ribs and lodged against the backbone. And they began asking him why how he knew to dig there and what it was. 8 of those brethren wrote about this in their diaries, and 4 of those brethren became prophets of the church. And this is what Joseph Smith said after he went and prayed. Heber C. Kimball in his diary has a good description of what happened here. But in Joseph's diary, he says, the visions of the past being opened to my understanding by the Spirit of the Almighty, I discovered that the person whose skeleton before us was a white Lamanite, a large, thick-set man, and a man of God. His name was Zelf. He was a warrior and chieftain under the great prophet Onondagas, who was known from the Hill Cumorah or Eastern Sea, connecting Hill Cumorah and Eastern Sea, to the Rocky Mountains. And then the time period, he was killed in the battle, not the last battle, but in battle by the arrow found among his ribs during the last great struggle with the Lamanites and Nephites. So Joseph is giving us geographical information and telling us that it is by inspiration. Well, the Book of Mormon is a spiritual text. It's not an atlas, it's a spiritual text. And it says it contains prophesyings and revelations, and it's written by way of commandment and also by the spirit of prophecy and revelation. We need to look at it. The Book of Mormon contains prophecies and promises to and for those who are led by the hand of the Lord to the land of promise, and not as a geographical text. It's not written to be a geographical text. In the Doctrine and Covenants, we read that for the very purpose these plates are preserved, which contain these records, that the promises of the Lord might be fulfilled, which he made to his people, that the Lamanites might come to a knowledge of their fathers, and that they might know the promises of the Lord, and that they may believe in the gospel. So the Book of Mormon is written for the prophecies and promises that are there. We know that there has to be a law of witnesses. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. And the Book of Mormon tells us that the Lord will bring forth the words of the book in the mouth of as many witnesses as seemeth him good. The Book of Mormon geography must also have, to look at Book of Mormon geography, must also have multiple witnesses within the text and without. These witnesses fall in the categories of internal and external testimonies. They are spiritual witnesses or physical witnesses that we're going to talk about. Because the Book of Mormon is a spiritual and prophetic text, these prophetic or spiritual witnesses would be a more sure word of prophecy than the physical witnesses itself. Spiritual or prophetic witnesses, there's 2 things you need to do, or a few things you need to do. Identify the Book of Mormon prophecies and promises that testify in relation to the promised land and the peoples associated with it. The inspired and revealed statements of the prophet Joseph Smith on geography. The physical witnesses, the real world evidence such as correlating civilizations in the correct time frame, archaeological findings as described within the text, cultural lifestyles, genetic relationships, and linguistic ties. And then the fourth one would be the geographical indicators or passages contained within the Book of Mormon. Now, when you take all of these together and look at them, and this is in the order of reliability, probably the one that cannot be argued with are the prophecies and promises about the promised land itself. That's revelation, that's inspiration, that's scripture. The second one would be the inspired and revealed statements of the prophet Joseph Smith on geography. And every time, again, when he talked of geography, he almost always claimed inspiration on it. So these, and this is in order. Then you move into the physical witnesses. When you've exhausted the spiritual or prophetic witnesses, you move into the physical witness, such as archaeological findings, cultural lifestyle, genetic relationship, and linguistic ties. And then the fourth and last, the most unreliable of all witnesses would be the geographical passages, because they're incidental remarks. If you were going to go into a court of law, you would never begin with the geographical passages. The prophecies and promises cannot, the scripture cannot be argued with. The statements of the prophet Joseph Smith cannot be argued with. The physical evidence, there can be opinions and differences. In geographical passages, we can have 150 different places based on the same geographical passages. The geographical passages in the Book of Mormon have been chosen as the primary source for the two Cumorah theory at the expense of all others, because, and I think it's because they want the desire for physical proof. They want to be able to show, they want to be able to prove physically that the Book of Mormon is true. And so they have fallen into that trap, into that pit. Well, theories are created to support opinion. In the limited geography theory, because of physical ruins, because they have ruins in Central and South America, then they have to invent a second Cumorah because it doesn't fit. The one Cumorah theory doesn't fit. They have to say that there's no Israelite DNA in Central America because there were so many people, the masses that were there when Lehi landed, they were already there, and so their DNA just disappears. Then they say that Joseph Smith just didn't know anything about geography and was not inspired in his statements. And then so far as the prophecies and promises go about the promised land, they have to say that they're hemispherical. They really include everything. But you have to let the text speak for itself. There's two promised lands in Scripture, the land of the Bible and the lands of the Book of Mormon, or the land of Joseph in the Book of Mormon, or the land of Judah in the Bible. There's two promised lands that the seed of Abraham have been promised and led to for their inheritance. Two promised lands from which Scripture originates, testifying of the resurrection and atonement of Jesus Christ in the meridian of time. Two promised lands in which the gospel was taught personally by the Savior and recorded to Scripture. Two promised lands from which the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph become one in his hand. Two promised lands for the gathering of Israel and the gathering of Joseph. Two promised lands in which the priesthood organization is restored with a counselor quorum of 12. Two promised lands in which the Church of Jesus Christ is first established. Two promised lands whose capitals are Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem. Two promised lands from which will go forth the law and also the word of the Lord. Two promised lands of the second coming. We have to look at these things. We read in D&C 57, "Hearken, O ye elders of my church, saith the Lord your God, who have assembled yourselves together according to my commandments in this land, which is the land of Missouri, which is the land which I have appointed and consecrated for the gathering of the saints. Wherefore this is the land of promise and the place for the city of Zion." And that a new Jerusalem, we read in Ether 13, as Moroni gives us some editorial comment, and that a new Jerusalem should be built upon this land unto the remnant of the seed of Joseph, for which things there has been a type. The Lord brought a remnant of the seed of Joseph out of the land of Jerusalem, that he might be merciful unto the seed of Joseph, that they should perish not. Wherefore the remnant of the house of Joseph shall be built upon this land, and it shall be a land of their inheritance, and they shall build up a holy city unto the Lord, like unto the Jerusalem of old. Telling us that the promised land of Lehi is for the seed of Joseph, and that's where the New Jerusalem is going to be. Heber J. Grant in April 1830, this is 100 years after the organization of the church, there was the first presidency issued a proclamation. This is one of those, I think it's 9 proclamations, that we could, or seem to be proclamations. And he writes, "It was not by chance that the Puritans left their native land and sailed away to the shores of New England, and that others followed later. They were the advance guard of the army of the Lord, predestined to establish the God-given system of government under which we live, and to make of America, which is the land of Joseph, the gathering place of Ephraim, an asylum for the oppressed of all nations, and prepare the way for the restoration of the gospel of Christ and the reestablishment of his church upon the earth." Well, Joseph had two sons while living in Egypt, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh ends up through Lehi, moving over to the promised land. Ephraim goes into the northern countries with as the 10 tribes are taken captive, goes into the northern countries. Well, so we see the remnant of Manasseh and the descendants of Ephraim, those Puritans and pilgrims, those Gentiles who come out of captivity, meet in that promised land. Manasseh creates a record and then hides up the record. And then the descendants of Ephraim translates those plates into the Book of Mormon. They translate that record. And almost the very first commandment that Ephraim gets, Joseph gets, is in 18th September of 1830, to take that record, now that it's translated, now that it's been uncovered, taken out of the earth and translated, printed and prepared, is to take that record to their brethren from Manasseh. In D&C 28 we read, "And not behold, and now, it should be now, behold, I say unto you, that you, Oliver Cowdery, shall go into the Lamanites and preach my gospel unto them." Almost the first commandment, I mean, the first missionary effort, and almost the first commandment with the Book of Mormon, is to make sure that you get it back to the descendants of Lehi. Parley P. Pratt writes about this mission. "Thus ensued our first Indian mission, in which we had preached to the gospel in its fullness, and distributed the record of their forefathers among 3 tribes, their forefathers, vis-a-vis the Catarangas Indians near Buffalo, the Wyandots of Ohio, and the Delawares west of Missouri," almost in the same area that the Zion's March went. Joseph Smith writes in the history of the church, he says, "I accordingly went down and met with Keokuk, Kishkukash, Appanus, and about 100 chiefs and braves of those tribes, the Sac and the Fox, with their families." And Joseph continues, "I conducted them to the meeting grounds in the grove and instructed them in many things." And look at what he says, "which the Lord had revealed unto me concerning their fathers." There's revelation again. "Which the Lord had revealed unto me concerning the fathers, and the promises that were made concerning them in the Book of Mormon." Now, that's 2 different things, in my opinion. There's something current and prophetic in which the Lord had revealed to me concerning their fathers that may not be in the Book of Mormon. And then he says, "And I revealed unto them the promises that were made concerning them in the Book of Mormon." Joseph Smith's diary entry, Thursday, May 23rd, this is just a month before his martyrdom, he writes, "At 1 p.m. I held a council with the Indians, the Sac and the Fox, in my back kitchen, and replied that the Great Spirit wants you to be united and live in peace." And then he explains, "I found a book," and he holds up a Book of Mormon, presenting the Book of Mormon, "which told me about your fathers. And the Great Spirit told me, you must send to all the tribes you can and tell them to live in peace." So he's holding up the Book of Mormon with these Native Americans, saying, this book is about your fathers. Well, in the book, years ago, I went, when I was working with Rod Meldrum a little bit, I went through the Book of Mormon and tried to put together all the prophecies and promises that speak about this land within the text itself. And the number on the left there, that 33, that number on the left is dealing with how many times that shows up in the Book of Mormon. So about the land and the land of promise, it comes down into 2 different categories, the land and the land of promise, and then the Gentiles upon the land. And so I'll go through this really quick. It's a land of promise 33 times, a land obtained and consecrated for an inheritance 20 times, the land choice and precious above all other lands, a land that will be cursed because of wickedness, a land consecrated and holy to those who are led there by the Lord, a land of prosperity and security, a land that shall be a land of liberty. The New Jerusalem will be built upon that land. It's a land where all shall worship God or be destroyed, a land prepared for those led to it, that's been prepared for those led by the hand of the Lord, a land never to be brought down into captivity, a land fortified against all other nations, a land only for those brought by the hand of the Lord, a land kept from the knowledge of other nations, a land where none shall molest or remove their inheritance, a land not to be governed by kings or kings of Gentiles, a land where the seed of Lehi is to be visited by Christ, and a land and the record be kept about those who having possessed the land. Now, if you ask me, that doesn't sound quite like Guatemala or the Yucatan Peninsula to me. And the land of promise now connected to the Gentiles. These are the prophecies and promises. The Gentiles to scatter and afflict the remnant. The Gentiles not to destroy the remnant. The Gentiles to obtain the land and promise for an inheritance. The Gentiles to be blessed and prosper on the land. The Gentiles will become multitudes upon that land of promise. The Gentiles will be shown mercy by the Lord and receive the gospel. The Gentiles to bring the Bible to the remnant, and the Gentiles to have other books of truth, and the Gentiles to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to that remnant. Gentiles to come out of captivity to this land. The mother Gentiles will battle against the Gentiles to come out of captivity. The Gentiles upon the land of promise are protected by God. The Gentiles will become a mighty nation upon that land. This land to be a land of liberty to those Gentiles. The Lord's servant to be among those Gentiles that come, or descendant of those Gentiles that come out of captivity. The Gentiles not to remain in blindness. The church is going to be established among the Gentiles of the land, and the Gentiles to bring forth a marvelous work, or to bring forth the Book of Mormon. So those are the prophecies and promises that are in the Book of Mormon about the land of promise and about the Gentiles that are going to be upon that specific land of promise. You have to be able, the prophets have wasted time and space on those plates and their prophetic time if you can't determine where that land of promise is and that site is from the Book of Mormon itself. Well, the New Jerusalem in the city of Zion. In the Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, we read that he has spoken by the mouth, the Lord has spoken by the mouth of his prophets, and for the gathering of the saints to stand upon Mount Zion, which shall be the city of the New Jerusalem, which city shall be built beginning the temple lot, which is appointed by the finger of the Lord in the western boundaries of the state of Missouri. Verily, thus saith the word of the Lord, that the city of New Jerusalem shall be built by the gathering of the saints, beginning at this place, even at the place of the temple. So we know where the New Jerusalem is going to be built, in the western boundaries of the state of Missouri, the city of the New Jerusalem, and that's where Jackson County is. And we're told that in the Doctrine and Covenants. This is Christ speaking. He says, and this is in 3rd Nephi. Christ says, and it shall come to pass, I will establish my people, O house of Israel, and behold, this people, that's who he's talking to, will I establish in this land, that's where he's at, unto the fulfilling of the covenant which I made with your father Jacob. And this land, shall be the place of the New Jerusalem, shall be a New Jerusalem, and the powers of heaven shall be in the midst of this people. Yea, even I will be in the midst of you. Joseph Smith said, it's been said by many of the learned and wise men or historians that the Indians or aborigines of this continent are the scattered tribes of Israel. Behold, this people. Now he's quoting Christ now out of the Book of Mormon. He says, this people will I establish in this land unto the fulfilling of the covenant which I made with your father Jacob, and it shall be a New Jerusalem. And then he goes on and says, now we learn from the Book of Mormon the very identical continent and spot of land which the New Jerusalem is to stand, making sure that we cannot mistake. And Christ is doing the same thing in 3rd Nephi. He goes on and says, but if they, the Gentiles, will repent and hearken unto my words and harden not their heart, I will establish my church among them, and they shall come unto the covenant and be numbered among the remnant of Jacob, whom I have given this land for their inheritance. And they shall assist my people, the remnant of Jacob, and also many of the house of Israel shall come that they may build a city which shall be called the New Jerusalem. Joseph Smith always identified the saints with the Gentiles that come out of captivity. Again, Moroni talks in Ether 13. After the waters have receded off the face of this land, it became a choice land above all the other lands, a chosen land of the Lord. And it was the place of the New Jerusalem, which should come down out of heaven, and the only sanctuary of the Lord, and the holy sanctuary of the Lord. This land, where he's at, where the brother of Jared was at, where Lehi was at, and it will be the place of the New Jerusalem. Again, in Ether. Ether saw the days of Christ, and he spake concerning a New Jerusalem upon this land, and that a New Jerusalem should be built upon the land under the remnant of the seed of Joseph. Wherefore the remnant of the house of Joseph shall be built upon this land, and it shall be a land of their inheritance. And they shall build up a holy city to the Lord, like unto the Jerusalem of old. And then cometh the new Jerusalem for the remnant of the seed of Joseph. It's interesting that there's two lands of promise, one in the Holy Land, or one where Moses led the children of Israel to, and there's the land of promise that Lehi comes to. One is for the tribes of Israel, and the other one is for the patriarch, for the patriarch of all of Israel, which is the house or the seed of Joseph in that promised land of that Lehi comes to. And these are all the same place. The New Jerusalem upon this land, the New Jerusalem should be built upon this land. Upon this land is the New Jerusalem. Christ goes on to say in 3rd Nephi, this is chapter 21 this time, for verily I say unto you, these things which I declare unto you. That means, again, the demonstrative, these things, the things that I'm talking, the things that I'm saying right now, the record of the things that I'm saying now, right now, which I declare unto you, and which shall declare unto you hereafter myself, shall be made known unto the Gentiles, that they may know concerning this people who are a remnant of the house of Jacob, and concerning my people who shall be scattered by them. When these things, i.e. the Book of Mormon, shall be made known unto them, the Gentiles of the Father, and shall come forth from the Father, from them unto you. For it is wisdom in the Father that they, the Gentiles, should be established in this land where he's at, where Bountiful is at. They shall be established in this land and be set up as a free people by the power of the Father, in order that these things might come forth from them unto a remnant of their seed. So he's telling us we can't mistake it. In D&C 10, after Joseph lost the 116 pages, the Lord tells Joseph what's in the book, what needs to come forth, and why it's important to protect the book as well as the plates, the translation needs to be protected. He's telling us what these prophets said, and the Lord begins explaining to Joseph Smith, and behold, all the remainder of this work, that's what he hasn't translated, of this work contains all those parts of my gospel, which my holy prophets, yea, and also my disciples desired in their prayers should come forth unto this people. Yea, and this was their faith, that my gospel, which I gave unto them, that they might preach in their days, might come unto their brethren, and the Lamanites, and also all that had become Lamanites because of their dissensions. Now, this is not all. Their faith in their prayers was that this gospel should be made known also, if it were possible, that other nations should possess this land. So he's talking about two different, it's interesting and important what he's saying here. That last verse, that this gospel should be made known also, if it were possible, that other nations should possess this land. He goes on, and thus they, those prophets of the Book of Mormon, did leave a blessing upon this land in their prayers, that whosoever should believe in this gospel in this land might have eternal life, that it might be free unto all of whatsoever nation, kindred, tongue, or people they may be. And behold, according to their faith and their prayers, I will bring this part of my gospel to the knowledge of my people. For this cause have I said, if this generation harden not their hearts, I will establish my church among them. Nephi goes on and explains, after all the house of Israel have been scattered and confounded, the Lord will raise up a mighty nation among the Gentiles, even upon the face of this land, and by them shall our seed be scattered. And after our seed is scattered, the Lord will proceed to do a marvelous work among the Gentiles, which will be of great worth unto our seed. And that's exactly what the Lord is trying to explain to Joseph Smith in section 10. That's in the rest of the book. That's why he needs to be careful. And that's why the book needs to come forth, is because of the promises that have been made by the prophets and the promises that have been made by Christ in 3rd Nephi that we've already read about. In 1st Nephi 13, again, and it came to pass, I beheld the Spirit of the God, that it wrought upon other Gentiles, and they went forth out of captivity upon the many waters. This is coming back to the Puritans, pilgrims. It came to pass, I beheld that many multitudes of the Gentiles upon the land of promise, and I beheld the Spirit of the Lord that it was upon the Gentiles, and they did prosper and obtain the land for their inheritance. This is exactly what the Lord is telling Joseph Smith in section 10 of the Doctrine and Covenants about the purpose of what's of the book, and the purpose that freedom needs to be on this land. Again, in 1st Nephi, and it came to pass that I, Nephi, beheld that the Gentiles had gone forth out of captivity, did humble themselves before the Lord, and the power is with them. Their mother Gentiles are gathered together upon the waters, and upon the land also to battle against them. and that the Gentiles that had gone forth out of captivity were delivered by the power of God out of the hands of all other nations. Now, this is talking about, we all know about the Revolutionary War, but it's talking about those Gentiles that come out of captivity. And remember, as we began, Nephi and Lehi are making sure that we know exactly where that land is, that those Gentiles that come out of captivity, it's the land that was covenanted to Lehi to be an inheritance for his posterity. This land, saith God, shall be a land of thine inheritance, and the Gentiles shall be blessed upon this land. This land shall be a land of liberty to the Gentiles, and there shall be no kings upon the land, and I will fortify this land against all nations. Christ said that the Gentiles had to be set up as a free people. This is in 3rd Nephi again. The land that the Gentiles had to be set up as a free people in order that the Book of Mormon can come forth, in order that these things that he's speaking can come forth. In 2 Nephi 1, again, Lehi, this land is consecrated unto him whom he shall bring. If it so be they shall serve him according to the commandments which he has given, it shall be a land of liberty unto them. Therefore they shall never be brought into captivity, and if they are, it'll be because of iniquity. As Mormon writes, now behold, this I speak unto their seed, and also to the Gentiles who have care for the house of Israel, that realize and know from whence their blessing come. Now, this is interesting. This is an interesting verse. He's speaking to the Lamanites. I speak unto their seed, the Lamanites, in the future, and also to the Gentiles who have care for the house of Israel. And the Gentiles who have care for the house of Israel are the descendants of Joseph. They are the patriarchs. They are responsible for the temporal and spiritual welfare of all of the other tribes of Israel. The patriarch has the responsibility to gather Israel, and therefore must be gathered first. That's why Ephraim and Manasseh need to be gathered first. And they are the descendants of Joseph and have that patriarchal responsibility. But he's talking to those Gentiles who have care for the house of Israel, and those that realize and know from whence their blessings come, the gospel. In section 109, Joseph Smith, in the dedication of the Heartland Temple, Joseph writes this. He says, now these, in prayer, now these words, O Lord, we have spoken before thee concerning the revelation and commandments which thou hast given unto us who are identified with the Gentiles of the Book of Mormon he's talking about. So the spiritual or prophetic witnesses identify the Book of Mormon prophecies and promises testified of in relation to the promised land and the people associated with. The inspired and revealed statements of the prophet Joseph Smith. These are the first two things we need to do in order to begin to determine where a setting might be for the Book of Mormon. The third, then we start looking at the physical real world evidence, such as correlating civilizations, correct time frames, archaeological findings, cultural lifestyles, genetic relationship, and linguistic ties. And the last and least important are the geographical passages contained within the book itself. But we have to ask ourselves the question, well, what about the evidence such as the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, the great white God, and other lands that indicate one like Christ was there? Well, the Book of Mormon answers that. The scriptures answer that too. Talks about other sheep, the other sheep that are out there. And Christ says in 3 Nephi chapter 16, he says, and verily, verily, I say unto you that I have other sheep which are not of this land. Speaking to the Nephites, they're not of this land. He says there's other ones that aren't of this land, or of the land of Jerusalem, or any of that land round about where I've already been to minister. So look what he's saying. He says, there are others out there, not from here, not from Jerusalem, or not from anywhere else I've already been. There's still more out there. There's still more out there. He says, I've received a commandment from the Father that I shall go unto them, and they shall hear my voice and shall be numbered among my sheep, that there may be one fold and one shepherd. Therefore, I'm going to go show myself unto them. We learn in Nephi, know you not that there are more nations than one, that I remember those who are upon the isles of the sea, and I bring forth my word unto the children of men, yea, even upon all nations of the earth, that I remember one nation like unto another. Wherefore I speak the same words unto one nation like unto another. That's how we make them one fold and one shepherd. Then he goes on and he says there, for I command all men in the east and in the west and in the north and in the south, in the islands of the sea, that they shall write the words which I speak unto them. And then we read here, for behold, I shall speak unto the Jews, and they shall write it. And I shall also speak unto the Nephites, and they shall write it. And I shall also speak unto the other tribes of the house of Israel, which I have led away, and they shall write it. And then he says, and I shall also speak unto all nations of the earth, and they shall write it. Now, just think for a second, what if at the meridian of time, or after the resurrection of Christ, that the whole world had the gospel by manifestation, by visitation? What if the whole world, and we see this almost in Jacob chapter 5, and the allegory of the olive trees, and how they're scattered throughout all of the earth, and they're nourished, all of them are nourished, but then there is a universal apostasy, even among those given on a choice spot of ground. But he says he's going to visit the Jews, they're going to write it, the Nephites are going to write it, all of the other tribes of the house of Israel, they shall write it, and all nations of the earth, and they shall write it. Well, Christ, it says, will visit all nations of the earth, and they're going to write it. All nations will hear and write his words. However, that doesn't make all nations he visits the promised land of the Book of Mormon, because it's specific to a particular land with particular specific restrictions. These traditions of Christ visiting or speaking will show up in their art, their architecture, their myths, their symbols, their oral and written records and traditions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are the Nephite or Lamanite cultures. Again, Mormon and Moroni, with a view of a fallen culture and people, write by inspiration and commandment, a record specifically for the world, and that record contains the fullness of the gospel. The church, it's a record of a fallen people, and those that live on the promised land, it has those deed restrictions. Well, anyway, the requirement or the statement for all of my classes is you don't have to believe a word I say. You have the scriptures and you have the words of the prophets to be your sources rather than myself. Paul, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Wow, Bruce, thank you. And as usual, sipping from the fire hose. We love the content that you bring us. It's outstanding, and I genuinely appreciate it. I'm gonna, I haven't received any questions as of yet. What I'd like to do is take over the hosting again real quick, and I want to share my screen quickly. And there we have it, Bruce's basement, Bruce's man cave, just kidding. But Bruce, again, thank you very, very much. I want to point out to everyone that you spend an enormous amount of time putting stuff like this together. And what many people don't realize, though, is, Bruce's file cabinet is second to no one as far as reference materials. So I just thought, as a side note here, Bruce, I wanted to point people out, pointed out to your website and specifically the file cabinet and people's ability to research all the things that you share. And that's the reason I've called on you and Jonathan alike. Jonathan, mentioned his MOB, MOMB, I believe was the acronym, and where the Museum of Literature can be found. I think it's invaluable, and I think it's important that we mention that before we close things up here. I know most of the people that participate in this forum are aware that you've written dozens of books and many papers. And that file cabinet alone, just yesterday, I was perusing through it briefly, and I noticed that there was over 50 articles or papers written by Nibley himself. And I know you draw upon his stuff, and I think that lends a lot of credence to many of the things that you share with us, which I think is important. As far as though Book of Mormon lands, I think perhaps the most important book for people to have a look at would be this one, Remembering the New Covenant, the Book of Mormon, and the Everlasting Decree. personally my favorite one. With that, we've really coming right at the very end of our time. I'm just so grateful for what people have been doing and supporting us. And I just want to mention that, yeah, we did have, again, a little technical difficulty at the beginning. There was a dozen or so people that weren't able to get on. I want to apologize to them and make sure we'll take care of them. I'm going to make sure that they get a recording of the event. And for those of you that wish to have a recording of the event, please let us know. I'll be glad to share that if you'll do as the speakers for this event have encouraged, and that is, please, would you share this? Share this with your friends. Allow them to see a different perspective on the Book of Mormon lands. Let them understand why it's so important that we understand the blessings and the deed restrictions, as Bruce puts it, and all that is so important for us to understand why the Book of Mormon lands are so important for us to have a firm understanding. Let's see here. Let's see if I can switch views. I'm gonna stop sharing there. Bruce, are you still with me or not?
I am, Paul.
Any closing comments? Any corrections that need to be made? Any last parting words?
Enjoy your evening.
Enjoy your evening. Excellent. All right, then we'll call it a night, and we will be doing another event. It's either going to be late March or April. Our hope is that we will focus in on either Heartland and some of the Christology associated with Heartland. We may do evidences of the Book of Mormon, which really roll in nicely as a complement to this particular session, or depending on Wayne May, if he's comes up with some great archaeological finds, it might be timely to join forces with him. So I don't know. I leave it up to the gentleman that I defer to. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to all of you. Thank you for your patience, and we will look forward to having you on board in the not too distant future. Thanks, and make it a great day.